On the other side of the island, Colin busied himself cleaning the stone house. 10 days of abandonment had allowed a thin veil of dust to settle over the surfaces. Fortunately, he had mastered the cleaning technique, and though he couldn't cast it instantly like seasoned wizards, it was still effective for basic housekeeping. Under its influence, the house was soon spotless again. Yet one problem still gnawed at him. He turned his gaze toward the brown wooden door panel, which lay broken at the entrance. A sigh escaped his lips. The damage had been caused by Hayward the last time they had clashed, and since then, it had remained untouched. Despite his confinement, nothing valuable had gone missing, mostly because there was nothing worth stealing. Anything of real worth was locked securely inside the meditation room. Colin scratched his head. He had no idea how to repair a door, nor did he possess the necessary tools. Looks like I'll have to wait until the beginning of the month when the supply shipment arrives. I can ask for help then, he mused. But almost immediately, he chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe I won't even need to wait that long. There was still a week left before the month ended, yet he needed only 5 more days to advance. After that, he wouldn't be living here anymore. With a decisive nod, he propped the broken door panel against the doorway, using a sturdy stick to hold it in place. It was a makeshift solution at best, but it would have to do. After all, if someone was determined to break in, this flimsy wooden door wouldn't stop them. He strolled over to the window that faced the sea and leaned against the frame. During his confinement, he had realized that watching the waves had become an unconscious habit, one he wasn't willing to abandon. The sky stretched above in a vast expanse of azure, mirroring the sea's deep blue. Wisps of white clouds drifted lazily, their reflections rippling upon the ocean's surface. The salty breeze kissed his skin, its crispness invigorating. I hope the place I move to next has a sea view, and if there's a balcony, even better, he thought to himself. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. Within the meditation room, Colin slowly opened his eyes. His gray wizard robe fluttered without a breeze, and with a single thought, pale golden particles gathered in his vision. Name, Colin Leonard. Rank, Intermediate Wizard Apprentice, 1 out of 100. Great Night, 19 out of 100. Meditation Method, Apprentice Circulation Meditation Level 1, 25 out of 100. Sunlight Breathing Method I, 60 out of 100. Witchcraft, Ignition Technique I, 52 out of 100. Condensing Water Skill Level 1, 41 out of 100. Light Brightness Skill I, 54 out of 100. Cleaning Technique, 26 out of 100. Steel Armor, 60 out of 100. Arrow Shooting Skill, 60 out of 100. Skill, Basic Level Magic Crystal Making. Bright Crystal Making I, 100 out of 100. Limit Breaking. Points, 18. A slow grin spread across his lips. Advancement had been successful. Once his excitement had settled, he summoned a thought, and instantly, a flash of white light enveloped his body. An invisible armor materialized over his skin. The steel armor spell, now fully mastered, responded instantly. Testing his newfound abilities, he picked up an arrow he had prepared earlier, aimed at a makeshift target in the corner, and released the arrow shooting skill. The arrow whizzed through the air and struck the wooden target with a sharp clang, embedding itself deeply. He systematically went through each of his spells, analyzing the effects. The most noticeable improvement was his enhanced magic power, at least 5 times greater than before. Even after casting all his spells once, he had only used a fraction of his reserves. It was clear, though he wielded the same spells, their potency had increased significantly. Advancement wasn't just a milestone, it was a transformation. The next morning, dawn broke gently, though the sky was overcast, hinting at imminent rain. Colin rose early, gathered his essentials, and prepared to report his advancement to the central castle. The wizard territory was structured as a vast square, with the grand central castle at its heart, where Wizard Lab resided. Advancing apprentices were required to report to the instructor stationed on the first floor. Colin's residence, part of the basic apprentice quarters, was situated on the outskirts, a 10-minute walk away. He didn't know what arrangements awaited him post-advancement, so he packed lightly, bringing only his bee sting and a few metal arrows for self-defense. The residential area remained eerily silent. The stone houses, spaced apart from one another, created an atmosphere of solitude. Though nearly 300 houses stood here, fewer than 100 were occupied, each apprentice deeply engrossed in their studies. The incoming arrow flew too fast, beyond even a great knight's reflexes. It grazed his left arm, the barely formed translucent armor flickering violently before shattering. The arrow still carried enough force to pierce through his blood-energy armor, leaving a shallow wound. Heart-pounding, Colin scanned his surroundings. The alley and streets lay empty, silent, devoid of life. A sense of dread crept over him. His gaze flickered to the wound. The cut wasn't deep, fresh blood oozing out in a normal shade of red. Relief settled in, until a sudden wave of dizziness struck. His vision blurred. His breath hitched. Poison? A sharp realization flashed in his mind. But before he could act, his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the damp ground. Dark clouds loomed above, thick and heavy. The air pressed in oppressive and still. Time blurred. From the shadows of an alley, Charlie emerged, gripping a now useless crossbow. He gazed at Colin's fallen form, his chest heaving with excitement. He had waited 5 days for this moment, watching, planning, ensuring his target would be vulnerable. Had the crossbow contained more than a single shot, he would have attacked while Colin was indoors. Carefully, he stowed away the crossbow, though a pang of regret struck him. The weapon had cost him over 20 magic stones, practically everything he had extorted from weaker apprentices. But it didn't matter. As long as he delivered Colin to the master, the rewards would outweigh the cost. The enchanted sleep crossbow only needed to graze its target. Even a minor wound would plunge a basic apprentice into deep slumber. To counter Colin's steel armor, Charlie had even inscribed a sharp rune onto the bolt. And now, his plan had worked flawlessly. Or so he thought. Whoosh! A sharp whistle cut through the air. Poochie! A piercing pain erupted in Charlie's leg. His balance crumbled, and he crashed to the ground. His wide eyes darted toward the source. Colin, propped weakly against a wall, his gaze steady despite his dazed expression. Damn it. Did it miss the mark? Colin muttered, his head still spinning. He had aimed for Charlie's chest, but had only managed to strike his knee. Charlie groaned, clutching his leg, his confidence shattering. He wanted to flee, but his legs refused to cooperate. He wanted to retaliate, but the pain rendered him useless. Colin hesitated for a moment, then reached for a noise arrow. With a flick of his fingers, he launched it skyward. Whee! The sharp, piercing sound echoed through the residential area. Charlie's face drained of color. Sweat beaded his forehead. He knew what this meant. From the distance, a figure in a gray robe approached swiftly, the golden badge on his chest glinting under the dim light. Instructor, the situation went like this. Colin fought back the lingering dizziness and recounted the incident to the gray-robed instructor standing beside him. Charlie, seated nearby, had given up struggling, his expression resigned. The instructor listened without reaction, then extended his left hand, summoning the arrow that had injured Colin. With another gesture, he retrieved the arrow from Charlie's knee along with the hidden crossbow, inspecting them closely. After a brief examination, he turned to Colin. You've advanced to a second-class apprentice? Yes, Colin replied promptly. Good. Though the instructor's face remained neutral, there was a subtle shift in his tone, perhaps a hint of approval. With a wave of his hand, a soft white glow enveloped Colin, instantly dispelling his dizziness. Thank you, instructor, Colin said with a respectful nod. The instructor's gaze then settled coldly on Charlie. While the lap school tolerated conflicts between apprentices of equal standing, insubordination against a superior-ranked apprentice was treated far more severely. Charlie likely knew this, but his greater concern was that his entire scheme had been exposed. Go wait for me at the main tower entrance of Black Castle. I need to handle this matter first, the instructor instructed Colin. After a slight pause, he added, I am the first-class apprentice on duty today. I will record your promotion upon our return. Understood, Colin responded respectfully. Not only had he described Charlie's attack, but he had also detailed the suspicious backstory Charlie had mentioned, the so-called Mutual Assistance Association and its enslavement of outcasts. The instructor's reaction suggested he had never heard of such activities before, which only deepened Colin's doubts about Charlie's claims. Before long, Colin arrived at Black Castle. The imposing fortress stood at the heart of the wizard territory, its central main tower flanked by two massive side towers, forming an inverted U-shape. Its walls, built entirely from enchanted black stone, exuded an aura of power and mystery. A well-maintained lawn stretched before the entrance, a contrast to the dark fortress. Colin followed a neatly paved stone path toward the towering doors, where he noticed a brown-haired boy waiting, a youth who appeared slightly older than 10, likely another newly advanced apprentice. The boy cast a brief glance at Colin's black badge, but chose not to greet him. Colin, in turn, had no interest in unnecessary pleasantries. A few minutes later, the gray-robed instructor descended from the sky, his robes billowing with the force of his controlled descent. Watching his effortless flight, Colin couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration. If his guess was correct, this instructor specialized in force field magic. "Good day, instructor," Colin and the brown-haired boy greeted in unison. "Follow me," the instructor ordered with a nod. They ascended to the upper floors of the main tower, stopping before a heavily guarded chamber. "Hand over your identity badges." Colin and the other apprentice complied, passing their black badges to the instructor. Without another word, he disappeared into the room, likely communicating with the great witch array that governed the wizard territory security. Each badge was personally crafted by a lap wizard, uniquely bound to its owner, and essential for accessing restricted areas. Even the commoners who delivered monthly supplies carried their own distinct badges. Half an hour later, the instructor returned, presenting them with newly upgraded silver badges. He then led them to a quiet room on the first floor. Inside, two other wizards sat waiting, both first-class apprentices, as indicated by the badges on their chests. The instructor gestured for Colin and the brown-haired boy to sit while he approached the others. "Milne, has another third-class apprentice advanced?" one of the seated wizards asked with a casual smile. Milne, the gray-robed instructor, nodded. "Yes. One in 5 years, 13 years old, second-class aptitude. Another in 10 years, 17 years old, fourth-class aptitude." Their conversation was hushed, yet Colin, a trained great knight, caught every word with ease. "The one who's been here for 10 years will be assigned to the guard team. He'll receive his spells later. As for the one with 5 years, it's our turn this time," the wizard on the right interrupted. "The last two went to you. This one should be ours." "Not necessarily. The previous apprentice had first-class aptitude at 10 years old. That's a significant difference from second class." The wizards began a quiet but intense debate over apprentice assignments. Colin glanced at the brown-haired boy beside him, who remained expressionless. Clearly, he hadn't overheard the discussion. Colin, however, pondered their words carefully. A wizard's aptitude was divided into 5 levels, with 5th class being the lowest and 1st class the highest. While it primarily indicated magic affinity, it wasn't an absolute determinant of success. In theory, even a 5th-class apprentice could become an official wizard given enough effort. Similarly, the time spent studying magic was another aspect of aptitude. Colin realized he likely wasn't considered exceptionally talented in either regard. Eventually, the wizards reached an agreement. Milne and another wizard approached Colin. "Come with me. I'll take you to receive your spells for advancement." The brown-haired boy was led away by the other wizard. Colin followed Milne deeper into the castle, his expression calm. As they walked, Milne lowered his hood and turned toward Colin. "Unlike basic-level apprentices, intermediate apprentices are assigned additional responsibilities. You'll be joining the guard team." Colin glanced at the instructor's gleaming bald head and gave a small nod. He had anticipated this outcome. "What exactly does the guard team do?" he asked after a brief silence. "The guard team ensures internal security in the city and collaborates with Blackstone City's wizards. It deals with rogue beasts from the Dark Forest and maintains law and order within the city." Milne paused, then added, "The lab school's work is divided into 3 main areas: logistics, mining, and security. Security is handled by the guard team in the city and the patrol teams in the wizard territory. Colin furrowed his brows slightly. Station? You mean permanently? Yes. The guard team is permanently based in Blackstone City. At those words, Colin's heart sank.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another video of Fanfic Canon. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy our content. It really helps a lot. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments section below. Let's get started.
The reason the lab school was built upon the mountain was not to display its status. Rather, it was because the magic power here was the most concentrated, which benefited wizard training. This was also why many wizards from Blackstone City chose to live halfway up the mountain, closer to the school. If one needed to be stationed in the city for an extended period, it would clearly affect their training progress. Talents with less potential get assigned to the guard team. Colin realized the logic behind this allocation was clear when considered from the school's perspective. Obviously, it involved prioritizing the training and advancement of apprentices with potential within the wizard territory, whereas those with less potential were sent to hone their combat abilities in the city's guard team, handling trivial matters. For the school, this was a perfectly rational way to distribute duties. But for Colin, it was quite the opposite, and he couldn't help but sigh inwardly. The guard team is actually a good gig. The wizard in gray robes discerned Colin's thoughts and consolingly said with profound meaning, "You see, the school is the real ruler of this island." Colin was puzzled. When you get to the guard station in the city, you'll understand why I say this. The wizard in gray patted Colin's shoulder and said no more. The Lap wizard had been here for 60 years, but to this day, the school still had not produced a second official wizard. In his view, apprentices with Colin's qualifications were obviously not destined to become official wizards. Going to the guard team to enjoy life was undoubtedly a better choice for them. The two walked a little further and arrived at a study room. Though it was called a study room, there was only one bookshelf inside, and upon closer examination, the books on it seemed to be duplicates. The wizard in gray took 2 books from the shelf in turn and handed them to Colin. These are the magic spells rewarded by the school. If you want to learn others, you'll need to use magic stones or contribution points to exchange for them afterward. However, because you're going to the guard station, you'll get 2 additional spells for dealing with polluters, more than what regular apprentices receive. He found 2 more magic books. Colin accepted them, stacking them together, and oddly felt like it was reminiscent of receiving textbooks back in school. He looked down at the books he was holding, which were Detect Evil, Purification Evil Power, Hope Defense Field, Fireball Technique. The first 2 spells were the extra ones provided for free to the guard team. Polluters? He couldn't help but remember the eerie man he had encountered in the city earlier. That must have been what was known as a polluter. Aside from wizards, this world was filled with many phenomena that were hard to explain. Polluters were one such phenomenon. Their origins were varied and strange, with exposure to knowledge beyond their understanding being one of them. For apprentices like Colin, the first lesson they learned was never to chase knowledge too fervently. In this world, knowledge came at a cost. After receiving the books, the wizard in gray also gave him a voucher and told him the address of the guard hall, letting him leave and report by tomorrow. The moment Colin returned to his stone house, a storm suddenly erupted outside. He silently leaned against the window, staring at the churning, boundless ocean outside, momentarily speechless. The waves surged in layers, their motion incessant. The loud thunder drowned out the noise of the rain and overpowered the sound of the waves. The white seabirds that were usually visible were nowhere to be found now. The world outside was an expanse of indistinctness, as the torrential rain seemingly connected the sea surface with the sky, blurring the distinction between the rain falling from the heavens or rising from the sea. The rain kept pouring while the clouds seemed to grow even thicker. Darkness had fallen inside the stone house. Colin cast a spell to light the bright crystal. A gentle white light spread uniformly inside the room. He sighed and prepared to tidy up his belongings. Oh! Just then, a dull cry suddenly erupted. Colin froze on the spot, as if his heart had been gripped tight, and it was 2 seconds before he recovered. For some reason, the rain outside began to gradually cease. With a pale face, Colin wasn't frightened. Instead, he stepped out the door. The rain outside the door had already stopped, but a careful observation revealed that a torrential downpour was still raging in the distance. Only this part of the island remained dry, as if an invisible umbrella had been held up over it. People from other houses were also coming out one after another, and they all, as if by tacit agreement, looked up at the sky. Colin also lifted his head, an indescribable amazement. A gigantic whale was leisurely roaming through the sky. Its massive, deep blue body blocked all the rain, creating a dry area. From time to time, lightning struck at it, yet it was like a clay ox entering the sea, stirring no waves. This was the thunderstorm cloud whale, a creature the previous owner of the memories had also seen a few years ago. It was gentle by nature, never attacking anything, which is why the wizard territory hadn't activated the protective shield, though of course it might not have been effective even if they had. The thunderstorm cloud whale usually lived in the deep sea, only occasionally surfacing in the sky during torrential rain to chase lightning. This was a rare and peculiar sight. Too bad, although the thunderstorm cloud whale looked leisurely and slow. Its flying speed was so fast that even an official wizard might not be able to keep up. Therefore, it soon vanished from Colin's sight. The rain began to fall again. The rain continued until the afternoon, when it gradually stopped. The clouds dispersed, sunlight shone down upon the earth once more, and a rainbow even appeared in the distance. Colin had also nearly finished packing his things. He didn't have much to take with him besides a change of clothes, mainly just books and bee stingers. As for the knight sword and armor left behind by the original owner, he planned to sell them at the market later. As his strength increased, the benefits of knight training manifested more in terms of vitality. For combat, however, it couldn't compare to witchcraft. Even the bee stinger at his waist had become more of a decorative accessory. Thus, Colin decided to only practice the breathing skill of a knight, no longer expending energy on combat skills. After selling various things at the market, the items in the room had significantly diminished, probably enough to fill just one large bag. Colin got up and went to the bedside table to pack up the last of his belongings. Unintentionally, he saw a brown letter and a sheet of white paper inside. Colin's expression briefly faltered as he slowly picked them up. Stroking the red and blue intertwined flame emblem on the brown envelope, he felt somewhat sentimental. That golden-haired cute girl, she had probably turned into a handful of yellow soil by now. He carefully placed the envelope and white paper into a gray backpack. Then, slinging the backpack over his shoulder, he took a final look around the stone cottage and stepped into the meditation room for a moment. Finally, he went to the window and, as usual, leaned against it, looking at the calm azure sea in the distance. The vast ocean stretched to infinity, with white birds circling above and their reflections on the glittering waves responding to each other in harmony. Colin took a deep breath, no longer lingering, and stood up to walk outside the house. Upon leaving, he turned to look back at Erica's cottage next door. He hesitated for a moment, seemingly having thought of something, then turned and walked towards Erica's door. A few minutes later, he set off again, heading down the mountain towards Blackstone City. He left Erica a sheet of white paper. It didn't say much, just a simple recounting of recent events, about Charlie, the Mutual Assistance Association, and how he had advanced and been assigned to the guard team. He also let her know he had received the white paper and letter, and that if he had the chance to return to Ryan, he would take the letter to her parents. As evening fell, the sky flushed red. On the mountain road, Colin's figure, carrying a bag, gradually moved farther away. Colin walked slowly through the small city, following the address given by the gray-cloaked wizard, to arrive in front of a rare 3-story building in the city center. He was a bit surprised. Wasn't this the same place where he had exchanged the limit-breaking fire technique with Wizard Berkeley? Upon reflection, it seemed quite normal. After all, Berkeley was probably also a member of the guard team. Colin stepped inside and, after asking around, headed towards a room in the middle of the first floor. Before he got there, he could faintly hear voices conversing inside. The strength of a great knight combined with an intermediate apprentice rendered his senses exceptionally sharp. Recently, several fierce beasts have emerged from the dark forest. Our colleagues there are suffering terribly. I heard that another wizard died. Seems like it was someone from the Poke gang. Another wizard died? Sigh. The beasts are getting stronger and stronger. I also heard from a brother in East City that the beaches there have been restless every night lately. The voices in conversation paused for a moment, then resumed. It's still better here. Giant Axe Tavern got some new dancers, you know. Knock, knock, knock. By this time, Colin had reached the door and knocked on the wooden panel. Please come in. The speaking inside halted for a moment. Then one of them called out. Colin pushed the door open. Seated behind the dark brown wooden table were two intermediate apprentices, one fat and one thin. I'm new here to report, said Colin, approaching calmly and passing over his credentials and school badge. Welcome, welcome. We rarely get new people in the guard team. Please have a seat, the fatter wizard said with a flash of surprise on his face, smiling as he took the credentials and badge, speaking amiably. After verifying the credentials and badge, the fat wizard returned them to Colin, then continued. Colin, is it? My name is Leiden Jeremy. Just call me Leiden, and beside me is Jerome Elton. You go with him first to get your equipment. I need to ask Master Red Flame for your assignment. With that, Leiden gave Jerome a knowing look. Come with me. The lean Jerome stood up, smiling as he spoke. Colin nodded and followed him. As they went upstairs, walking on the staircase, Colin asked, Senior Jerome, I wonder what Senior Leiden meant by assignment. Assignment refers to the area you'll work in within the city. Blackstone City is quite large, and the guard team has 3 locations here. One is this headquarters, and the other 2 are in East City and West City. Colin nodded in understanding, then asked, Is there any difference between these 3 places? No real difference, the treatment is all the same. It's just that East City and West City are farther from the city center, not as lively and prosperous. Jerome paused before replying. Colin nodded, his expression calm. They soon arrived at a room at the end of the 2nd floor. Jerome gestured for Colin to wait outside, then opened the door and went in. In a short while, he came out with a black wizard robe in hand. This is the guard team's uniform wizard robe, needed when on duty. A cleaning technique is permanently affixed to it, so you don't need to worry about cleaning issues, he said as he spread out the robe, showed it fully to Colin, and then handed it over to him. Downstairs, the fat wizard Leiden was speaking to the communication witch array. That's too little. 60 magic stones are too few, at least 80. What too much? You think it's too much. I even think it's too little. You know very well how rarely we get a new person. If it weren't for our good relationship, I would have sold them to someone else long ago. Do you know how many people in West City want to transfer back to headquarters? Others have given at least 80. Fine, fine. Why didn't you do this earlier? Don't worry. Can't you trust me to do the job? Would I ruin my own reputation? Leiden closed the witch array with satisfaction. After giving 30 magic stones to Jerome, he pocketed another 50 magic stones for himself. He took out a pen and spread the records across the desk. Then, on the part of the record for West City, he slowly added the name Colin Leonard. He'd done this kind of thing more than once already. Initially, he was terrified, afraid of getting caught. But now he was adept at it, especially after dragging Jerome, who also managed the records, into the business, and he grew more audacious. In his view, it was a situation where no one lost out. He got his magic stones, his friends in West City got their desired transfer to headquarters. As for Colin, the young man wouldn't be accustomed to the easygoing life at the headquarters. West City was more suitable for him. Not only were the conditions the same as at headquarters, but it was also close to the dark forest. Not to mention the beautiful scenery. Occasionally, fierce beasts would emerge to provide practice for witchcraft. Those fierce beasts were valuable. Their skin, fur, bones, and blood could all be traded for money. The group in West City was much wealthier than them. Sitting in his chair, the more Leiden thought about it, the more he felt his plan was considerate. No one's interests were harmed. This was clearly a win-win-win situation. With 50 magic stones in my pocket now, I can have another grand time at the Giant Axe Tavern. I just can't decide whether to go for the half-elf or the merfolk lady. He creak. At that moment, the wooden door was pushed open, and Jerome returned with Colin. Leiden straightened his posture and put on a gentle smile, nodding slightly at Jerome's probing gaze. I've already asked Lord Red Flame. Colin, you're assigned to West City, he said, looking at Colin. Upon hearing this, Colin nodded calmly. Jerome, standing beside him, sighed. What a pity. If you were assigned to headquarters, Leiden and I would definitely take you to the Giant Axe Tavern every day. But West City is not bad either. He patted Colin on the shoulder and continued. It's getting late. You should hurry to West City with your certificate to report in. Otherwise, it'll be a hassle once it gets dark. Colin accepted the new certificate and nodded slightly. West City? Even though Jerome had earlier told him that all 3 locations were similar, the conversation he eavesdropped on when he arrived suggested otherwise. West City, being close to the Dark Forest, was obviously more arduous and dangerous. The mention of another wizard has died from their conversation heightened his concerns. This place was not within the protection of the school. Enemies would no longer hold back like Charlie and Hayward had, refraining from taking his life. Here, people could actually die. Colin, holding the new certificate, turned and left calmly, sighing inwardly. Unfortunately, the outcome of the assignment was not under his control. On the bright side, at least he no longer needed to worry about being expelled from the school. Jerome had also told him that members of the guard team received a salary of 10 magic stones each month. Completing specific tasks would result in corresponding rewards. That was decent enough, certainly much better than being a third-ranked apprentice. He walked toward the door and left. Colin hadn't reached the door when it was pushed open, and a red-haired man walked in. Lord Red Flame, Leiden, and Jerome hurriedly greeted in unison, with respect. Instructor Bennett, Colin also hurriedly greeted. He listened to the way Leiden and Jerome addressed Berkeley and felt a bit surprised in his heart. So Berkeley is the Lord Red Flame they spoke of. Berkeley glanced over the 3 of them, casually nodded, and then walked straight toward the bookshelves on the left. He seemed rather busy. Colin watched Berkeley's retreating figure for a moment before continuing towards the outside of the door. The island was really small. He hadn't expected Berkeley, whom he had met by chance earlier, to be his immediate superior now. Jerome had previously introduced to him upstairs. In the school, logistics, protection, and mining were each managed by 3 special advanced wizard apprentices. They were stronger than the typical advanced wizard apprentices and were known as peak wizard apprentices. They were the 3 most hopeful candidates in the school to advance to official wizard. The peak wizard apprentice in charge of protection, also the direct superior of both the guard team and the patrol team, was the Lord Red Flame they mentioned. That was the Berkeley Barnett he knew. Colin gently pulled the door open. Wait a moment. Just then, as if remembering something, Berkeley suddenly turned and called out to him. He looked at the silver badge on Colin's chest with some surprise and said, You've advanced to intermediate apprentice? Yes, Lord Bennett. Colin frowned, apprehensions rising in his mind as he reflexively glanced at Leiden. Hadn't he reported this to Berkeley already? Seeing Leiden's unnatural expression, he seemed to understand something and added for Berkeley. I've just advanced not long ago. The school assigned me to the guard team, and today is my first day reporting. Berkeley nodded, then asked, Have you received your equipment? I have. Good. Do well here at headquarters in the future. The moment Berkeley's words fell, Leiden and Jerome's faces suddenly turned sour. They both looked at Colin with pleading eyes. Colin finally understood. He lowered his head, pretending not to see the look in Leiden and Jerome's eyes, and said solemnly, But wasn't I assigned to West City, Lord Bennett? Berkeley raised his eyebrows, looked at the puzzled Colin, then turned back to Leiden and Jerome. My lord, I think I remembered wrong and accidentally assigned him to West City. Leiden hurriedly explained. Berkeley's expression cooled, and anger flickered in his eyes. He clearly saw that Leiden was lying. The assignments for the guard team were always rotated. After the East City was last, it should be headquarters in the Middle City this time. If one wanted to change to another location, there had to be a mutual agreement for exchange, and both parties had to be willing. And finally, they had to apply to him, and only after his approval could the switch be made. Colin in front of him was clearly unaware of this, and Berkeley had not received any applications, let alone given approval. Berkeley suppressed his anger and said nothing, just kept a cold face and continued to stare at Lydon and Jerome. Under his icy presence, Lydon's defensive voice grew fainter until, unable to bear the pressure, he spilled the beans at last. "That's the situation, Lord Red Flame. It was my greed that blinded me," Lydon said, hanging his head low. "My lord, it's my fault too. I shouldn't have covered for him," Jerome added regretfully. After listening, Berkeley stood expressionless for a while before finally he began to speak slowly. "I'll deal with the two of you in a moment." He turned his head toward Colin and asked, "What's your choice, Leonard? To stay at headquarters or to go to West City?" Colin reflexively wanted to answer stay in the city, but when he looked up and met Berkeley's calm gaze, he suddenly changed his mind and said, "Can you tell me the difference between the two, Instructor Barnett?" Berkeley's expression remained calm as he nodded and replied, "If you choose to stay at headquarters, it'll be, as usual, no different from the norm. If you choose to go to West City, the 80 magic stones Lydon mentioned will all be yours." His tone was calm, unbiased, merely stating the facts. Colin pondered for a moment, then asked, "What specifically is the difference between West City and the city center, Instructor?" "I've heard that West City is especially dangerous, and even wizards have died there. West City isn't as bustling as the city center, with taverns and restaurants being quite rare, but it's closer to the magic vein. Therefore, the concentration of magic power is higher. Because it's close to the dark forest, fierce beasts occasionally emerge, making it indeed very dangerous. But fierce beasts serve as good practice for witchcraft. Regarding the wizards you mentioned who have died, this is true. However, casualties among our guard team members are exceedingly rare. For a newcomer like you, there will be a month's buffer period. During this month, you don't need to do anything. Just need to learn the 4 spells provided by your school. Once you've learned them, you'll start being responsible for patrols, and usually, in the beginning, you'll be paired up with older apprentices." Berkeley paused, then added, "Of course, this doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be safe from life-threatening dangers, as I said. It's rare for the guard team to have casualties, but it's not non-existent." Colin thought quietly to himself, and soon he made his choice. He looked calmly at Berkeley and said, "I choose West City, Lord Barnett." After hearing so much about it, he was clear about the differences between the city center and West City. If this had been in the past, he would have definitely preferred to choose a comfortable life within the city, but now his mindset was completely different. Power is the foundation for standing in this world. To give up the pursuit of power is tantamount to a slow suicide. The drawback of the lower concentration of magic power in the city center was intolerable for him. His hesitation before was due to the dangers of West City. But now, after Berkeley's detailed explanation, he understood that West City was not as dangerous as he had imagined. Most of those who had died were probably wizards from other forces, perhaps even just basic-level wizard apprentices. As an intermediate wizard apprentice of the school, and with golden paper at his disposal, he believed that being cautious would be enough to avoid losing his life. Moreover, if he chose to stay in the city center, wouldn't he be missing out on 80 magic stones for nothing? 80 magic stones was not a small amount, and Colin had never had access to so many magic stones before. Although he didn't immediately need so many magic stones, it was always good to have more. For now, at least the limit breaking points needed for Bright Crystal making Ida break limits again had increased tenfold. If the second limit breaking also required a tenfold increase, it wouldn't be long before he found himself in short supply of magic stones. So he needed to start accumulating magic stones as early as possible. Upon hearing Colin's choice, Berkeley nodded, not saying much else. He simply instructed Lydon to take out 80 magic stones and hand them to him. Colin was somewhat surprised. Berkeley now had Lydon directly give him the magic stones, undoubtedly saving him a lot of trouble. Lydon, looking somewhat pained, took a purse and fished out 80 magic stones to hand over to Colin. Colin accepted the magic stones without a word, glancing at Lydon. Lydon's face was full of pain, but beyond that, there seemed to be no other emotion. "Thank you, Lord Red Flame," I will now go to West City to report. Colin turned his head to Berkeley and said, Off you go. Berkeley nodded. Colin pushed open the door and walked out. It was getting late, and he needed to hurry to report to West City. After arriving at the guard team's residence in West City, it was already approaching evening. The burly department head of the guard team's West City division received him. There were a total of 5 advanced wizard apprentices in West City, not including the burly department head himself. The other 4 each served as team captains. The department head was named Barton Keith, and he took Colin to a room at the corner of the 2nd floor. Then he told him to stay here for the first month and peacefully practice witchcraft, as someone would be specifically responsible for providing food. After 1 month had passed, he would then be assigned a duty. Barton's demeanor was gentle and calm. He didn't seem to care that he had replaced an experienced member. But just before leaving, he reminded him once again to swiftly learn the Hope defense field and the fireball technique. Colin quickly agreed and nodded his thanks. Setting down his backpack, he looked around the room. The room wasn't large, probably about 1/3 the size of the stone house he had lived in before. However, because it only contained a bedroom and a washroom, it still seemed spacious enough. For a temporary stay, it was entirely sufficient. Colin slowly walked over to the window. The windows were still wooden, but he could no longer see the familiar azure sea. He leaned out. What met his eyes were various types of low-lying buildings. To the left was the direction leading out of the city, where further away there were more buildings like palm huts and seaweed mud houses. They were densely packed, one on top of another, stretching into the distance, eventually obscured by the faint yellow city walls. To the right was the direction toward the city center. As one looked further inward, the buildings became more orderly, with brown wood houses and gray-black stone houses gradually replacing huts and mud houses as the majority. Leaning by the window, he stood for a while as the sun slowly sank. As evening fell, the surroundings gradually darkened. To the right, buildings in the city center had started to light up with spots of yellow light. Though not as dazzlingly colorful as the neon lights from his previous life, they still gave off an air of liveliness. Looking to the left towards the outskirts, only scattered lights were bright. Most buildings were pitch black. In the surroundings as well, only a few households had lit their lamps. No wonder everyone wants to stay at headquarters. Colin solemnly reflected to himself. He then withdrew his gaze and began his training. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Early morning, Colin sat on the carpet beside the bed. His thoughts moved, and he summoned the golden paper. Pale golden particles converged. Name, Colin Leonard. Rank, Intermediate Wizard Apprentice, 2 out of 100. Great Night, 29 out of 100. Meditation Methods, Apprentice Circulation Meditation, I, 35/100. Sunlight Breathing Method, I, 75/100. Witchcraft, 0 level tricks. Fire Making Skill, I, 100 out of 100. Condensing Water Skill, I, 100 out of 100. Light Brightness Skill, I, 100 out of 100. Cleaning Technique, 100 out of 100. 0 level Witchcraft. Steel Armor, 100 out of 100. Arrow Shooting Skill, 100 out of 100. Basic High Temperature Tolerance, 35 out of 100. Hope Defense Field, 32 out of 100. Fireball Technique, 43 out of 100. Detect Evil, 26 out of 100. Purification Evil Power, 18 out of 100. Skill, Basic Magic Crystal Making, Bright Crystal Making, I, 100/100. Limit Breaking Points, 18. Just as Barton had instructed, Colin hadn't left his room the entire month and had focused on learning witchcraft. After advancing to Intermediate Wizard Apprentice, he felt noticeably that learning witchcraft was easier than before. In just 1 month, he not only brought fire-making skill and other tricks up to the limit once more, but he also successfully raised steel armor and arrow shooting skill, 2 witchcrafts he had already mastered, to their limits. Furthermore, the 4 witchcrafts issued by his school and the basic high-temperature tolerance witchcraft he had obtained from his exchange with Berkeley had all been mastered. The only pity was that after advancing to intermediate, the progression of wizard training had once again become slow. Fortunately, progress hadn't completely stopped, and the meditation method could still be advanced further. Colin gathered his thoughts and continued to examine the golden paper. Fire-making skill I, light brightness skill I, condensing water skill I, and bright crystal making I. The witchcraft that had broken their limit once stood out on the golden paper with a blue outline glow. Now, behind them, a golden outline glow surrounded the symbols, signaling they could break their limit again. And the symbols behind steel armor and arrow shooting skill, like the ignition technique when it reached its limit, were also surrounded by a blue glow. Blue signifies a single limit break, and gold represents a second limit break. Colin speculated in his mind, but his gaze quickly shifted to the cleaning technique, which had also reached its limit. Its symbol was enveloped in a golden glow. Colin furrowed his brows, feeling somewhat puzzled. After long contemplation, he still couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. So he relaxed his brows and focused his attention on the symbol after the cleaning technique. On the golden paper, the characters representing the cleaning technique gradually became blurry and soon transformed into something new. Cleaning technique, 100 out of 100. Cleaning technique golden. Colin was taken aback. Why did the cleaning technique, after a single limit break, not have AI, but instead the word golden? Could it be that this means the cleaning technique has reached its ultimate limit? He recalled the information that appeared in his mind when the golden paper first emerged. Before the limit, all practice shall see progress. After the limit, one can use limit breaking points to break through and continue to improve. He pondered for a moment and hypothesized, perhaps due to my own knowledge or realm, different witchcraft have different numbers of times they can break their limits. And gold signifies having reached the current maximum limit of improvement. He carefully understood the golden cleaning technique. Moments later, he stood up and cast the golden cleaning technique on the bedding he had just cleaned that morning. Like a gentle breeze, the bedding seemed to be swept by an invisible hand, with the tiny impurities detaching and gathering into a ball, which landed in the trash can. Colin caressed the bedding, then bent down to take a sniff and looked up satisfied. No need to worry about cleaning ever again. Then he sat down again, took out a magic stone from his pouch, and summoned the golden paper. He began to add points frantically. Fire-making skill I, fire-making skill golden. Condensing water skill I, condensing water skill golden. Light brightness skill I, light brightness skill golden. Steel armor I. Arrow shooting skill I. Bright crystal making I, bright crystal making golden. A plethora of complex knowledge rushed into his brain. Colin closed his eyes tight, and soon sweat appeared on his forehead. But there was no headache, nor much discomfort, as the transfer of knowledge always maintained a level he could bear, overall quite gentle. As time passed by half a day, Colin finally opened his eyes, heart leaping with joy. He felt stronger than ever before. Unfortunately, there was no place for him to practice his witchcraft. He stored the remaining 53 magic stones back into his pouch and kept them close. This power enhancement had cost him 45 limit breaking points. If it weren't for the unexpected fortune of 80 magic stones, relying on the 18 limit breaking points he had originally saved up, it would have been impossible to afford breaking the limit of all his witchcraft so lavishly. Looking at the rows of dazzling golden characters on the golden paper, Colin felt a satisfying and refreshing comfort. After all, magic stones were external possessions, while the strength that one attained was forever their own. It was nearing midday. Knock, knock, knock. The sound of knocking arose. It must be the delivery of food, Colin thought. He set aside the bee needle and stood up to open the door. He had just been testing the strength of steel armor I. The results were quite satisfying. If the old steel armor was equivalent to 5 millimeters thick, then now it was at least 2 centimeters. If he were to encounter the arrow shot by Charlie again, he reckoned even his defense wouldn't be breached. Creak! Colin unfastened the latch and pulled open the wooden door. Perhaps because things near the sea corroded easily, doors here generally made a creaking noise. Minister Barton? He was surprised to see the burly man standing outside the door. Good day, Colin. Barton nodded slightly. A month has already passed. How are the 2 witchcraft schools doing? They are mostly mastered. Good. Detect evil and purification evil power can be learned slowly afterward. Our main issues in West City are still the fierce beasts. Compared to that, Hope Defense Field and Fireball Technique are more useful. Colin nodded slightly, not mentioning that he had essentially mastered 4 schools of witchcraft. Barton stepped aside slightly, revealing a man behind him who appeared somewhat shorter compared to him. This is Holt Caesar, your future team captain. Holt Caesar smiled, with a gentle demeanor and pale skin free of wrinkles. At first glance, he seemed about the same age as Colin. But upon closer inspection, it made one feel as if it were impossible to discern his exact age. Captain Holt, Colin greeted quickly. Holt Caesar nodded slightly. All right, Holt will explain the rest of the matters to you. I will take my leave now. Yes, Minister Barton, Colin said respectfully. Barton nodded slightly and strode upstairs. Holt Caesar withdrew his gaze from Barton's retreating figure and said warmly to Colin, You go and pack your things. There's still plenty to do later. Yes, Captain. Colin walked back inside. Holt Caesar didn't follow him, but instead slowly walked to the end of the corridor and stood by the window, gazing outside. Shortly after, Colin came out with a neatly packed gray backpack on his back. He looked around and eventually found Holt Caesar's figure on the left. Although it was daytime, the corridor's lighting wasn't good. Only the windows at both ends and the light from the gaps in the doors on both sides allowed light to enter. The window where Holt Caesar stood happened to be sun-facing, and the brilliant sunlight shone upon him. For a moment, Colin felt as if he saw a large tree growing towards the light. Sprouting branches, budding leaves, the profusion of tender green and dark green. Large and small oval leaves grew wildly. Soon, they filled every corner of his vision. His face turned to shock. The golden sunlight was still shining, but it emitted a chilling, eerie coldness to the core, seemingly without warmth. The corridor filled with shadows, the thriving tree, now appeared more like a twisted, monstrous black creature. A fuzzy model of a Hope Defense Field inside his mind emitted a faint light, dispelling the darkness. There were no shadows, no monsters. Bright, golden sunlight streamed in from the window, wrapping Holt Caesar in a soft halo. Colin was a bit dazed, his complexion pale, fine beads of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Captain Holt, he called out slowly, his voice somewhat strained. Are you ready? Holt Caesar turned around. Only then did Colin notice that Holt Caesar actually had a rare head of green medium-length hair. Holt Caesar also noticed Colin's discomfort, raising his right hand. A gentle white light flashed over Colin. Thank you. Colin finally felt much more comfortable. Holt Caesar nodded slightly, advising, Your intuition is quite high. Later on, you could cultivate more mind-protective witchcraft. Colin nodded emphatically. The related knowledge the original owner had studied before, but he had never known that his inspiration was so high. The recent abnormality must have been caused by the radiation of the energy field inadvertently emitted by Holt. To put it in terms of his previous life, he was haunted. Fortunately, the Hope Defense Field was a defense spell that considered both physical and mental protection. Let's go. We should head back to the school first, Holt said. It's my turn to pick up the magic stones distributed in West City this month. I need to make a trip back first. The two descended the stairs. Holt cast a floating technique on Colin and then flew with him towards the Lap wizard territory. The speed of flying was indeed much faster than walking. What would normally take at least 2 hours by foot was estimated to take less than 10 minutes now. After all, a large part of the walking path involved climbing hills and winding roads, far from a straight line. But flight was different. There were no obstacles, and it always took the shortest distance. Before entering the school, Colin saw dozens of apprentice figures mysteriously gathering on the vacant ground below. He was somewhat puzzled. Not until he recognized many familiar faces did he suddenly realize. Considering the time, the 3-month deadline must have just arrived. Those below should be apprentices about to leave the school. He felt a surge of indescribable emotions, but they were quickly dispersed by the strong wind in his face. The two continued to fly toward the center of the wizard territory, apparently aiming to land directly at Black Castle. Did anyone succeed in advancing? Asked an instructor standing at the forefront of the clearing in a routine manner. As he expected, no one responded. Line up, take out your identity badges one by one, he continued indifferently. The apprentices were about to leave the school, so naturally, their identity badges needed to be collected and dealt with. Haywood stepped forward first, handing over his black, triangular badge with both hands. Extend your right hand. The instructor took out a black disc, placing the badge on one end while indicating the other end to Haywood. Haywood extended his hand and placed it on the surface, his expression calm. Relax your body, the instructor advised, then began to infuse magic power into the disc. With the infusion of magic power, the disc slowly lit up with a faint white light, only to dim suddenly the next second. Haywood's eyes flickered with a trace of panic. The instructor frowned and examined the disc, then tried once more to infuse magic power. This time the disc successfully lit up with the white light enveloping the identity badge. Soon, the inscribed Haywood Moses began to blur, eventually disappearing. On the other hand, the white light also entered Haywood's right hand and gradually moved towards his brain, ready to erase the imprint of the badge. For some unknown reason, however, it suddenly disappeared just as it was about to enter the brain. The instructor didn't notice anything amiss and simply continued. Next, Haywood withdrew his hand, his expression calm as he walked down the mountain with his backpack, not looking back. Meanwhile, inside Black Castle, Colin listened to the story of the gray-robed wizard before him. After a long while, he spoke words of gratitude and watched as the gray-robed wizard walked away. He was waiting on the first floor of Black Castle for Captain Holt to collect the magic stones. He had just happened to encounter the gray-robed wizard. The gray-robed wizard was Milne, the same one who had flown over during the day of Charlie's attack. Colin had just asked him about the final outcome of the incident with Charlie. As he had guessed, what Charlie said was false. No evidence of any school apprentices enslaved at the gathering place existed. The school had specifically called in many apprentices to carefully check, and no traces of enslavement were found. As for why those people believed Charlie, according to Charlie himself, it was because of this sleeping fantasy flower. The apprentices had been deceived by the sleeping fantasy flower. The school had indeed detected remnants of the sleeping fantasy flower in their bodies, which had now been uniformly cleared. As for Charlie, he had been demoted to slavery by the school and ultimately bought by the peak apprentice Nidham. Nidham! A chill ran through Colin's heart. The person to whom Annie had originally sold herself was this peak apprentice in charge of logistics. He vividly remembered Annie's final pitiful state, covered in tentacles. Charlie is probably going to, Colin suddenly looked up in surprise. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. At the entrance on the first floor of Black Castle, Nidham was leading Charlie inside. Charlie was numbly following Nidham, wearing linen shorts. His bare upper body was covered with dense, centipede-like, gruesome wounds. His limbs were covered with dark gray hair. Even the originally blonde hair had been replaced by the deep gray fur of a wild wolf. Around his neck was a black leather collar, attached to a black iron chain. The other end of the chain was held in Nidham's hand. Colin was silent inside. If it weren't for the resemblance to his former appearance, he would hardly believe this was Charlie. He felt no sympathy for Charlie, yet he couldn't help but feel vicariously sad. Good morning, Lord Nidham. Nidham approached slowly, and he hurriedly greeted him respectfully. Good morning. Nidham nodded in response, his handsome face displaying an impeccable smile. It was just too pale, almost ghastly white, giving an uncomfortable feeling. Nidham continued walking forward, but the iron chain in his hand conveyed a sense of resistance. At the other end of the chain, Charlie stood still, staring at Colin with extreme hatred, especially after seeing the silver badge on his chest. The hatred seemed to materialize, almost devouring him. Before this, he had learned of Colin's advancement, but he didn't believe it was such a coincidence. Why advance on the very day he attacked? He was filled with hatred. Even the pain of Nidham stripping the skin from his limbs and implanting the skin of a wind wolf couldn't cover the intense hatred in his heart, gnawing like ants on bone. The beast blood had clouded his brain, He couldn't understand the logic behind all this, couldn't understand why he ended up like this. But on every sleepless night, tormented by the wolf blood, Colin's detestable face always surfaced in his mind. Now he only hoped one day to drink Colin's warm blood, to tear and chew every inch of his flesh, every bone. Nidham observed this scene with interest. He stood relaxed, yet possessed a distinctive aura. It was as if a finely dressed noble was watching a favored drama in a theater. "It seems my little dog has some history with you." Nidham finally spoke slowly, his tone light. "He was an apprentice in the same year as me, Lord Nidham," Colin replied calmly. "Oh, I see." Nidham walked over to Charlie, and with his gloved hand, caressed Charlie's now slightly wolfish cheek. "Come on, little dog." He patted Charlie's cheek, then turned around, leading the leash, and continued walking forward. Roar! Dang! The metal chain instantly stiffened, and the steel, under the immense force, seemed to emit a sharp, twisting sound. Colin reflexively stepped back. The expression on Charlie's face in front of him was fierce, angrily opening his mouth wide to roar at him. Even the skin at the corners of his mouth had cracked, blood oozing from the tears, flowing down the skin, condensing into tiny beads of blood on his chin, dripping onto the cold, hard gray stone floor of the Black Castle. But he was completely unaware, only staring intently at Colin with his muddy eyes as if stained with blood. His eyes were full of violent hatred. "What's wrong, Lord Nidham?" Just then, Holt suddenly appeared. "Holt team." Colin subconsciously turned to look at Holt. Swoosh! But before he could completely turn his head, a gust of wind came from in front, and Charlie suddenly leaped at him. Buzz! Colin instinctively used his steel armor and pulled a dart from his waist to hold in his hand. But the distance between him and Charlie was too close, and caught off guard. He was still viciously tackled by Charlie, pressed against the cold, hard brick floor of the Black Castle. Seeing this, Holt hurriedly raised his hand, a green light flying towards Charlie. But immediately afterwards, a white light shot out abruptly from the side. Hiss! The green and white lights collided and ultimately annihilated each other. Lord Nidham? Holt was taken aback. "Don't be nervous, Holt." Nidham gracefully gathered the broken black iron chains. "Let my little dog catch up with him. Don't worry, there won't be any issues. Your subordinate is a great knight. Even if he is torn to pieces, as long as he is alive, I can ensure his safety," Nidham said in a gentle tone, his lips still wearing that impeccable smile. He paused, then added, "Besides, do you really think your subordinate can't even handle my little dog? Perhaps he doesn't need your help at all." A rare hint of annoyance flashed across Holt's gentle face. Although Nidham said this, it was clear that even he didn't believe Colin could withstand his little dog. Holt had no hope for it either. In terms of life transformation through witchcraft, Nidham was the foremost in the school. Even the wizard Lap admitted that in some areas he couldn't match him. How could Colin, who had just advanced to an intermediate wizard, cope with the transformed Charlie, especially at such close quarters? Even Colin being a great knight wouldn't help. After all, the human body has its limits. "Aren't you afraid Lord Red Flame will be angry?" Holt said sternly. "This lad knows Lord Red Flame, and it's because of him that Leiden and Jerome from the guard team were dismissed. Aren't you worried that Lord Red Flame will come after you?" Nidham's smile remained unchanged, but a flicker of coldness passed through his eyes. Although he and Berkeley were both among the top 3 peak apprentices, Berkeley was universally acknowledged as the strongest. Just as Nidham and Holt reached a standoff. Splat! Ah! A sudden scream erupted. Holt's expression changed, and he quickly looked over. Nidham's smile widened slightly, and he turned his head with composure. But the next second, his smile suddenly froze, and his pupils contracted slightly. Charlie was curled on the floor in agony, his abdomen bleeding profusely, slowly pooling into a puddle on the floor. Not far from him, a blood-stained arrow lay on the ground, clearly the culprit behind Charlie's injury. Colin stood unscathed on the side. In reality, Charlie had failed even once to breach the formidable defense provided by Colin's limit-breaking steel armor. He had been momentarily overwhelmed and knocked to the ground, but then he had seized the opportunity to retaliate with a limit-breaking arrow shooting skill. At this point, The rage in Charlie's eyes also dissipated mostly under the pain. He tried to push himself up, slowly moving toward Nidham, his eyes downcast, with a hint of regret. I was too impulsive. Damn the wolf's blood. His gaze grew slightly unfocused, but the hatred in his eyes churned. Survive, only by surviving is there hope. Colin! He struggled toward Nidham, his eyes filled with hope. But the next second, his hopeful eyes suddenly dimmed, instantly losing their vitality. Thump! The werewolf's body lost its strength and crashed heavily onto the floor. Nidham, expressionless, lowered his right hand and then replaced it with a smile. Useless dog, doesn't deserve to live. Then he looked up at the unscathed Colin and bowed apologetically. I apologize. My dog must have frightened you. His handsome face wore a sincere expression and a clean smile. If not for the overly pale skin, anyone would praise him, a sunny smile. Having said that, he elegantly turned and left, with Charlie's body floating behind him through casting. Before leaving, he also cast a cleaning technique to clean the floor. Colin, standing behind, finally began to catch his breath. He turned his head to watch Nidham disappear around the corner in the distance, and then slowly turned back. In front, Holt was looking at him with a face full of surprise. After a while, he finally spoke slowly. Let's go. I still have to acquaint you with your duties. We can talk as we walk. At the foot of the mountain, the Blackstone City Gate. Apprentices led by Hoa would had already arrived here. In front of the city gate stood a scattering of wizards, who were representatives from various major influences within the city responsible for recruiting the apprentices. Under their persuasion, some apprentices immediately decided on the spot to join a faction. More of them shook their heads in refusal, indicating a need to ponder further. Apprentices eliminated by the school could choose to join an island faction, become a free wizard, also known as a wild wizard, or wait for a merchant caravan to arrive and try their luck elsewhere. In the shadows atop the city wall, a wizard in a gray robe stood. His chest bore a golden triangular badge that shone brightly. After a good while, when the apprentices and the recruiting wizards had all departed without noticing anything unusual, he quietly slipped away. Elsewhere, Holt and his companion had also reached Blackstone City. He did not interrogate Colin intensively, as everyone has their own secrets, and moreover, Nidham's dogs, in his opinion, weren't very strong. Upon reaching the guard station, Holt took out 10 magic stones and handed them to Colin. This is your first month's salary. You'll collect it from me every month hereafter. Colin accepted it. Then, Holt instructed Colin to wait there. He needed to first distribute the remaining magic stones among the other 3 captains, whereas the rest of his team members would receive their share during their duty shifts. Our main responsibility is quite simple: to eliminate the fierce beasts that escaped from the dark forest. Half an hour later, Holt led Colin to the outskirts on the west side of the city. This area was a long, narrow plain that ran alongside the city wall in both directions. This plain was Blackstone City's primary food-producing land, with cultivated fields spanning as far as the eye could see. Many farmers were busily working in the fields at the time. Looking beyond the rice fields, without going too far, one could see the edge of the dark forest, which seemed to absorb the sunlight and appeared darker than other places. Holt pointed to a sturdy cabin not far away and continued, "What we need to do is take turns on duty here. If the patrolling knights report an incursion of fierce beasts, we deal with them. If not, we're free to do whatever we wish." Colin nodded in understanding. Wooden huts like this one were scattered roughly a dozen in number along the edge of the city wall, each spaced out from the others. The farmland extending outside the city was vast and elongated. Thus, only such an arrangement of shifts could ensure timely management of any danger from fierce beasts. Duty rotation is by squad. The cabins for team members on duty are connected. I usually live amongst you all, right? Our turn for duty starts tomorrow, and it's a night shift. Remember to come to West City Gate early to meet me," Holt added. Colin nodded once again. "All right, you've pretty much seen everything here. Next, you need to find a suitable place near the guard station to buy a house." Holt stopped walking and continued. "Buy a house?" Colin asked, puzzled. "Yes, buy a house. You don't intend to keep living in the barracks, do you?" Colin shook his head. Staying in the barracks was indeed inconvenient. Not only was the space small, but it also lacked privacy. Well then, you'll certainly need to buy a house. Not just a house, it's best if you buy some maids too, to help you with chores like cooking and cleaning. These aren't expensive. A house at most costs 1 magic stone, and maids are even cheaper. As long as you don't buy anything exotic, 1 magic stone is more than enough. The reason you were allowed to stay in the barracks, besides the 1 month grace period, was also because you probably didn't have spare magic stones to purchase a house and maids. Now that you've just received your salary, it's a good time to settle these matters. Oh, and Holt seemed to remember something else and made a specific point. Make sure you hire a cook who is good at her job. Many slaves simply don't understand cooking, so the stuff they make, you understand, right? Colin nodded. On the island, resources were scarce and the living standards of the common people were low. To say their usual meals were dark culinary arts would be a compliment. Most people only knew how to haphazardly stew things, and many couldn't even recognize all the spices. Later, Holt told him the location of the real estate transaction office and the slave market, then reminded him of some precautions to take and instructed him to remember to come here for duty tomorrow night before turning around and leaving. Half an hour later, Colin arrived at the real estate transaction office in the city center, where he was warmly welcomed by the manager. In this era, there were no pictures, so house hunting meant physically visiting each one. Accompanied by the manager and his entourage, he viewed over a dozen houses near the West City Guard station. In the end, he chose the third to last stone house. This stone house was a bit far from the West City Guard station, roughly a 10-minute walk away. The stone house was a 2-story building with a basement. It covered just over 100 square meters. Though not large, it was considered a mansion in Blackstone City. It was clear that the neighborhood's residents were not from the lowest social strata, as many had some connection with wizards. From time to time, you could even see some wizards appearing. The house was priced at exactly 1 magic stone. Houses in this world were not as cheap as in the last world. Of course, 1 magic stone was not a small amount either, roughly equivalent to 1,000 gold coins. After paying the magic stone and seeing off the manager, Colin slowly made his way to the main bedroom on the second floor. It was obvious that the master bedroom was specially constructed for wizards, as there was an additional door on the innermost wall, leading to a meditation room of about 30 square meters. But that was not the reason he chose this house. He walked slowly to the balcony. It was a large, open balcony, easily over 10 square meters, with intricately carved and exquisitely detailed railings. Leaning against the railing, Colin looked off into the distance. Beyond the city's closely packed gray and white houses, over the earth-yellow city walls, at the edge of his vision, a shade of blue came into sight. The ability to see the sea was the real reason he chose this house. The terrain within Blackstone City was not uniform. The location of this house happened to be on high ground. Coupled with its 2-story height, it offered the perfect conditions for an excellent balcony view. Not only could one enjoy a view of the sea, but the elevation also meant it was difficult for others to peer into the balcony. After quietly admiring the sea view for a while, Colin turned around to head to his next destination, the slave market. There were many slave markets within Blackstone City, and Colin went to the one closest to him. It was about a 20-minute walk from this newly purchased house. Although it wasn't his first time walking the streets of Blackstone City, he still felt somewhat uncomfortable. He wasn't someone who liked to draw attention, but now, no matter what time or where he went, he was always the center of attention on the street. The last time he came here to buy a sword, he hadn't worn his wizard robe, and the situation wasn't as exaggerated as it was now. But this time, not only was he wearing the guard team's standard wizard robe, but he also wore a bright, shiny badge of his school. Passers-by wouldn't even dare get within 2 meters of him. It seems I need to buy a carriage, Colin sighed to himself in his heart. He was like a red-hot knife through butter. Wherever he went, the crowd would automatically split apart. As he walked a little further, he felt something was off. For some reason, there were particularly many people here. Up ahead, the sounds of commotion were faintly audible. These damn gang thugs, they can only bully us. Hush! Do you have a death wish? Ah, the wizard lord is here. Just when Colin was puzzled, The crowd in front of him, like dominoes passed from person to person, suddenly parted to create a path. At the end of the path, a hairily robust short man was forcefully grabbing the wrist of a frail girl. Colin frowned slightly and continued to walk forward. The short man did not notice the unusual atmosphere around him. He leered at the girl and whispered, "Let me tell you the truth. There was nothing wrong with the bread from your bakery. I deliberately framed your mother." The girl's lips were tightly pursed, her eyes filled with anger, tears streaming down her cheeks onto the ground. "Do you know? Your mother was so naive to come and apologize to me. She didn't even consider how I could possibly let her off," the short man said, with a smug smile as he saw the anger in the girl's eyes. He loved seeing them angry, yet helpless against him. Had her mother not been too old, he might have kept her for his own pleasure. But it was time to give the girl false hope and take her for himself. Like before, play with her for a few months, then sell her for a good sum. His tone shifted. "Of course, my aim was always you, Renee. Just agree to me obediently, and I'll buy your sister back." At this moment, he finally noticed something wrong in the girl's gaze. He turned slightly, and when he saw Colin, his face instantly turned ashen. "My lord!" He quickly shrank back, dropping to his knees with a thud. Colin ignored him and walked on. Seeing Colin pass by without a glance, relief flooded through the short man's heart. For commoners like them, comparable to weeds, if they offended a wizard lord, death would mean death, with no one to seek justice for them. He saw that Colin was moving further away and turned to look at Renee. Perhaps from the shock of seeing Colin, he felt a sudden surge of brutality and raised his hand, intent on slapping her face. The girl instinctively closed her eyes, her eyelashes trembling with fear. But what landed on her face was not a slap. It was a handful of warm, foul-smelling blood. A metal arrow clattered to the ground. The short man's eyes quickly dimmed. His raised hand gradually lowered before he heavily collapsed. Colin withdrew his gaze, with the remaining traces of magic power from his witchcraft fading away. He continued forward, not dwelling on the deed he had done effortlessly. Although he was no good man, he found it difficult to remain entirely unaffected by such things, especially when the right and wrong of the situation were crystal clear and the action required from him was but a simple gesture. Inside Blackstone City, commoners and wizards were worlds apart in status. That short man, from his clothes, actions, and the words of the surrounding bystanders, clearly had no significant background. He didn't even need to explain himself. The guards would learn everything from the onlookers and take the initiative to clean things up for him. After walking a bit further, he suddenly frowned slightly and looked back. The girl he saved just now. Her name was Renee. She was following at a distance. Seeing him look back, Renee's face showed panic, and she instinctively lowered her head. She was not pursuing Colin. It's just that they happened to be heading in the same direction. Quickly, Colin also realized this and withdrew his gaze, continuing onward. Soon, he finally arrived at the slave market. The so-called marketplace in front of him was actually just a main street. People lined both sides of the street. Muscular men and young women, all with collars on their necks, and all common humans. Before coming here, Holt had told him that if he wanted to buy slaves like half-elves or other non-human ones, he had to wait for the biannual caravans or try his luck at the city center's largest slave trade market. Non-human slaves were generally more expensive because they typically had innate talents in certain areas. However, most of the non-human beings who had fallen into slavery were not so extraordinarily gifted. Holt even gave an example. On the second floor of the giant Axe Tavern in the city center, reserved solely for wizards, there were a few non-human dancers, such as half-elves, mermaids, catwomen, and so on. But the non-human blood in their veins was already very diluted, and at most, they could bring about some slight changes, mainly in appearance, such as the pointed ears of the half-elves, the fish scales of the mermaids, or the cat ears of the catwomen. Colin walked slowly down this street, his expression calm, but his heart somewhat heavy. Anyone seeing their own kind being sold as goods for the first time would inevitably feel uncomfortable. However, the slave traders lining the street didn't think so. When they saw Colin, their eyes lit up, believing a big customer had arrived. But they didn't dare to call out and beckon him, in case they offended the Wizard Lord. So, as if they had a plan, they simultaneously raised their whips and lashed out at their healthy slaves. In doing so, they attempted to catch Collins while showing off the strong bodies of the slaves. Crack, crack, crack. For a moment, the sharp snapping sounds were unceasing, mixed with faint groans of pain. Moreover, some slave traders directly tore off the clothes of the female slaves beside them, exposing their bodies, which were noticeably cleaner than the other slaves. Collins sighed inwardly. He wondered how these slaves were trained. They had such numb expressions that were extremely uncomfortable to see. The back of the long-haired male slave at the right front was gradually seeping blood. But as if feeling nothing, he stood blankly, his gaze vacant. The female slaves did not endure whipping, but their eyes were even more hollow than the males, as if deprived of life. With no desire to continue browsing, Colin randomly walked into a shop. As he drew closer to the shop, his brows involuntarily furrowed. Outside the shop was a black iron cage about a meter square, inside which a little girl of about 5 or 6 was confined. At this moment, the little girl was soundly asleep on a dirty piece of rag in the cage, her mouth slightly open and dribbling a bit. If one merely looked at her expression, one might think she was lying on a soft bed, deep in slumber. Just then, a feeble figure suddenly walked by from the left, crossing in front of him toward the cage. Looking up, it was Renee, the young girl he had just rescued on the road. Colin paused slightly. He looked at Renee and then at the little girl in the cage who bore some resemblance to Renee. He instantly understood. "Move aside, don't block the way of adults." The slave trader behind suddenly ran to Renee's side and hurriedly urged, "Trading slaves has strict regulations. What good does it do you to find me every day? I'm just a worker. You might as well try to save money. Once you have enough money, you can naturally buy back your sister." Then he walked up to Colin with eagerness and asked with a smile, "My lord, what kind of slave do you need? I just received a new batch of good ones. Do you have any slaves who can drive a carriage?" Colin asked. "Yes, my lord," the slave trader quickly replied. "Bring them out for me to see." "Yes, my lord." Colin watched the slave trader run toward the back and then called out to stop him, pointing to the cage with the little girl. "First, open this cage." "All right." The slave trader did not hesitate. He took out a bunch of keys from his bosom and found the right one to open the iron cage. Click! The sound of unlocking echoed. It was only then that Renee realized what was happening. She instinctively wanted to go to her sister, but the next second, she hastily knelt down. "Thank you, my lord. Your character is admirable, and your generosity I will never forget." Renee rambled on, her voice clear but somewhat faltering, seemingly not articulate. "Get up," Colin waved his hand, cutting off her awkward flattery. "Go see your sister." Renee did not comply this time. Instead, she insisted on saying all the praises she knew from beginning to end before slowly walking toward her sister in the back. Colin smiled faintly, though it was mere flattery. But who doesn't like to hear good words? The girl in front of him was a person who knew gratitude. At this moment, the slave trader had just brought out a few slaves. Glancing around, there was nothing particularly appealing. After listening to the introductions, Colin casually chose the most reliable-looking one, who was also the oldest male slave. He said he was about 40 years old, and according to the slave trader, he was the best at driving carriages among them. "My lord here." The slave trader handed over the indenture documents to Colin with both hands. Colin reached out to take them. There were 2 documents. One was for the little girl Demi Lydia, and the other was for the coachman Arthur. Arthur had no last name, only a first name. The 2 together were priced at 50 gold coins, equivalent to 1/20th of a magic stone. Colin turned and looked at Arthur standing quietly before him, pondered for a moment, then pulled out some gold coins from his pocket. "You know how to buy a carriage. Take this money and buy one to bring back." "Yes, master," Arthur responded. "You remember the address where I live, right? Once you've bought the carriage, come directly here," he added. "I remembered." Seeing Arthur nod, Colin waved his hand, satisfied, urging him to hurry. "By the way," do you have any slaves skilled in cooking? He turned back to ask the slave trader, almost forgetting that he still needed to buy a cook. Yes, I'll bring them for you, my lord. The slave trader hurried back inside. While waiting, he turned and slowly walked toward Renee and her sister. By this time, Demi had woken up and was giggling in her sister's embrace, with tear stains at the corners of her eyes. It looked like she had just stopped crying. My lord, seeing Colin approach, Renee quickly greeted him. She had been paying attention to Colin's side all along. Colin nodded slightly in response, bent down, and smiling at Demi, he patted her head. In his past life, he generally liked children, of course, excluding the unlikable and unruly ones. Demi's skin, though somewhat dirty, was still visibly fair and delicate, with features resembling a refined doll, very appealing. In this world, kindness is a luxury, but if he occasionally managed to do a good deed like this, it still made him feel at ease. After all, it wasn't much of a cost. It was just some inconsequential gold coins to him. Colin's smile was warm and sunny, and he was handsome. Demi, who had initially been slightly fearful, now mustered the courage to return a shy smile to Colin. Colin stood up satisfied. My lord, the cooking slave you requested has arrived. At that moment, the slave trader also came over with new slaves. All females, varying in height and weight. The only thing in common was their numb expressions. They looked just like dead fish being sold at a market. Colin slightly furrowed his brow, unable to hold back his criticism. It was unknown how they were trained, but these slaves were uniformly numb. Others might not know how they felt, but as for himself, he felt no interest in purchasing. What dishes can you make? He still asked aloud. Westmar. What else? Colin frowned slightly. Westmar was simply adding water and oil, stewing the ingredients until they became mush. Small fish Westmar, mango Westmar. Stop, Colin interrupted her, then paused before continuing. Give you a goat. How would you prepare it? This. The female slave suddenly froze. She had never considered such a question. Boil the goat head for soup. The fatty and lean goat meat can be directly roasted. The lean portions can be stewed with the bones, then stripped from the bones and eaten dipped in seasoning. And there are many other ways to prepare the ribs and legs. Suddenly, Renee spoke up beside him, her eyes pleading as she watched Colin. My lord, I have been learning culinary skills from my mother, who was a chef, since I was young. May I have the honor of becoming your personal cook? After the joy of reuniting with her sister subsided, anxiety swept over her again. Renee was well aware that even though Demi had now returned to her side, what about after that? She had no power to prevent Demi from being sold off again. In fact, she could hardly even protect herself. Wizards, both awe-inspiring and terrifying. But now that our parents are gone, I can't live carefree as before. You must seize the opportunity. Take care of yourself. Protect your sister. She looked at Colin expectantly, silently cheering herself on in her heart. Colin was momentarily taken aback, but quickly smiled and replied to Renee. Of course. A cook was just a cook. It hardly mattered whom he chose. The Renee in front of him was cute and pleasing to the eye, and according to her, her culinary skills were quite good. What was there to hesitate about? Worried about Renee bringing her sister along? Colin laughed at his own thoughts. As an intermediate wizard, am I not capable of supporting two maids? The position of cook Renee was requesting was not that of an employee. The moment she became Colin's cook, she became Colin's personal property. It also involved processing a slave contract. After Colin had taken care of the paperwork for the slave contract, he turned back and asked, Do you need to go back to pack up? No, there's no need, Renee hesitantly answered. Sister, why don't we go back? I want my little bear, Demi quietly asked beside her. Renee looked troubled, then comfortingly said, Can I make you another one later? Okay. Demi responded with a slight dejection, but still smiled at Renee. She was an obedient child, never crying or fussing even when she was locked in a cage. Renee couldn't help but bend down and hug her. Is there trouble back home? Colin asked. Nothing, my lord. Renee, Colin's tone became slightly stern. My first rule here is when I ask something you answer. Renee was startled by his tone. My lord, Don't be nervous. Just remember for next time, Colin's voice softened. For the common people of this world who suffered oppression, there was no need for him to deliberately establish authority. They already had the hierarchy ingrained in them. So sometimes being appropriately gentle could win their hearts even more effectively. Renee slowly revealed the reason under his gaze. So, the thugs before were from the Poke gang, and you're afraid they might be waiting at your house. Plus your uncle and aunt have already taken over your family's bakery, so there's nothing to pack up. Yes, my lord. Let's go. Lead the way, Colin said with a light chuckle, urging them. Renee still seemed hesitant. Colin didn't get angry, but simply said, My second rule here is obey. Obey my words. Yes, my lord. Renee hurriedly nodded in response. Colin didn't say more and had them lead the way. Now that they had become his servants, if there were still some matters entangling them from before, it was convenient to resolve them now. On the one hand, it spared future troubles, and on the other, it was a display of both kindness and authority. The gentle sunlight sprinkled across the earth. Colin walked on the road back home, followed by the Renee sisters. He led the way, his face calm. Behind him, Renee's complexion was slightly pale, as if she still had difficulty accepting what had just happened. Demi, who knew nothing of the matter, held her teddy bear with a face full of joy. After they returned to the bakery, everything went as Colin had expected. He did nothing, merely stood there, and Renee soon reclaimed the ownership of her family's bakery, which in the end was converted into gold coins and kept with her. But there were two surprises. The first was that the gang behind the stocky man he had killed on the road actually did come looking for him, and they had sent a fierce and intimidating strongman to wait for him at Renee's bakery in advance. However, he came specifically to apologize and even brought a box of tea leaves as a gift. The other surprise was that the mastermind behind the murder of Renee's parents turned out to be her aunt and uncle who had taken over the bakery. It was they who had colluded with the stocky man to murder Renee's parents. This was also the reason why Renee's feelings were so complicated now. Thinking of this, Colin sighed inwardly. In this world, for ordinary people, perhaps having beauty and wealth is also a misfortune. He thought back to his own past. Once upon a time, after listening to Charlie's conspiracy theories, as a basic-level apprentice of the school, dismissed by others, he came to Blackstone City and didn't even dare to wear the school's insignia openly in the streets. But now, he had advanced to an intermediate apprentice and became a full-fledged member of the school. In terms of status, it was heaven and earth compared to before. All of this is because of power. Colin exhaled softly. Soon after, they arrived at their home on Palm Street. When they reached their home on Palm Street, beside the rough iron gate, Arthur was sitting quietly on a single horse, black carriage with curved sides. Master, seeing Colin, he hopped down from the carriage, quickly stepped forward, bent over to greet him, and took out the remaining gold coins from the purchase of the carriage and handed them to Colin with both hands. Colin nodded, took the gold coins, and then picked out two more from them, placing them back in Arthur's hands. Thank you, Master. Arthur's face lit up with surprise. Take it and buy yourself a few decent sets of clothes. Keep the rest for yourself, Colin said gently. Then he turned to Renee, handing her 5 gold coins. You too. Go buy some clothes for you and Demi. With the leftover money, buy some ingredients to come back and cook dinner tonight. He surveyed Renee and Arthur, adding, In the future, you will both be able to get a salary of 1 gold coin each month from me. Of course, on the condition that you work diligently. In Blackstone City, for an ordinary middle-class family, an annual income would be just over a dozen gold coins. So 1 gold coin a month was clearly a high salary. Strictly speaking, Arthur and others were slaves. Colin had no obligation to pay them any further. But a few gold coins were not much for him, yet could greatly improve the enthusiasm of people like Arthur towards work and also increase their loyalty. Why not do it? Opening the double wooden doors enveloped in rough iron, Colin walked into the small courtyard of his home. The house he bought covered around 600 to 700 square meters, of which about 500 were just the front courtyard. Facing the main gate was the main building, a 2-story house with a basement, built in a Western style, its details revealing a sense of grandeur and nobility. To the right of the main house was an annex, a single-story bungalow, next to which there was a stable. You can choose any room to live in, except for the second floor and the basement. Anywhere else is fine, Colin instructed. Sir, I'll live in the annex on the right to take better care of the horses, Arthur said, taking the initiative. Colin nodded his head in a noncommittal way. Renee eventually chose a room on the first floor of the main house close to the kitchen, which had originally been where the former residents' servants lived. Renee, with Demi in tow, entered the room and set down their luggage. There was no time to tidy up, nor to marvel at the servants' room that was even more exquisite than her own home's master bedroom. She soon pulled Demi out again. She hadn't forgotten that Colin had asked her to go out and buy ingredients to prepare dinner. Before leaving, she sought Colin's approval. Go on, let Arthur take you. From now on, you don't need to tell me about each purchase unless you're short on money. Colin replied, and then gave Arthur additional instructions. For expenses like the horse's fodder and the like, find Renee, and she'll come to me for reimbursement. Both of them consecutively acknowledged. As evening fell, knock, knock, the sound of knocking came. Master, dinner is ready. Come in. Colin, seated at the study desk, was absorbed in reading a book and responded reflexively. Creak, the door was slowly pushed open. Renee, carrying a silver platter, walked gently to the table and carefully set down the plate, careful not to disturb Colin's reading. Appetizing aromas wafted to his nose. Colin closed the book and looked up at the two dishes and a soup laid out before him. The soup was a bowl of vegetable stew. The dishes consisted of a pan-fried steak and steamed clams, served with white bread as the staple. It wasn't exceptionally exquisite, but it was certainly above par, far surpassing his own culinary skills. Well done, Renee, he praised, looking up with satisfaction. Upon seeing Renee more clearly, a hint of astonishment flashed in his eyes, he added. That outfit suits you as well. Renee before him was dressed in a black and white maid's uniform. Its waist-hugging design made her somewhat slender figure now appear graceful, as if she stepped out of a comic book as a blonde maid. Her golden hair was still slightly damp, suggesting she had taken a bath. Colin was also taken aback, as he had simply thought Renee and her sister's clothes were a bit worn and had casually suggested they add a few new items to their wardrobe. But he hadn't expected her to buy a maid's outfit. Renee managed a strained smile upon hearing the compliment, her heart filled with more apprehension than the joy of being praised. Although she was frightened, she quickly exhaled deeply, regained her composure, and stood up straight once more. Fate had brought her hardships, but it had also given her the courage to face an unknown future. After making her choice, she had prepared herself to accept everything. Otherwise, she wouldn't have taken the initiative to bathe and change into new clothes. She tried to calm herself, accepting Colin's scrutinizing gaze, but soon, an uncontrollable blush crept up her delicate neck and spread across her fair cheeks. Seeing this, Colin smiled, thinking she was bashful from the praise, and offered an out. You should go eat as well. Just remember to come back and clear the tableware later. Yes, master. Renee responded respectfully and left, feeling slightly relieved. After she had left, Colin sampled the food on the table. The delicious flavors blossomed in his mouth. He couldn't help but smile, increasingly pleased with his decision to welcome Renee into his home. The next morning, Colin had just gotten out of bed not long ago. Renee brought him a steaming hot breakfast. Looking out the window at the still dim sky, Colin showed a satisfied smile. He then spent the entire day studying, with Renee cooking and handling miscellaneous affairs. His time was once again freed up. He never expected that one day he would also lead a decadent life of having everything handed to him on a silver platter. At noon, Colin briefly introduced lap school and some of the city's forces to Arthur and Renee, letting them understand their position and know which people they could provoke and which they couldn't. Of course, since he was not very familiar with the distribution of power in the city, he only gave a rough explanation and mentioned lap school again. During this, Arthur and Renee were in awe. They had never imagined that the real overlord of the island was the distant and unheard-of lap school at the mountain peak. Colin was not surprised by this, as ordinary civilians and wizards were completely different classes. Even though the wizards in Blackstone City didn't conceal their existence, the ordinary civilians' understanding of wizards was always limited. After hearing this, Arthur's attitude towards Colin became even more respectful and even reached the point of fear. Renee, however, was somewhat dejected. Time quickly reached evening, and after having dinner, Colin rode by carriage to the west gate of Blackstone City. After getting off the carriage, he instructed Arthur to come pick him up at dawn the next day, then let Arthur leave. Then he stood alone at the city gate waiting. After a while, as the sun set and only the last trace of sunset remained in the sky, Holt finally arrived. "Let's go. I'll take you there," Holt said as he strode towards the outside of the city. Other wizards also arrived gradually. This was not unusual, as apart from lap school, people from the 4 great gangs and the 3 families were also on duty. Holt led him to the rightmost side of the city. The duty cabin is not fixed. It rotates each time. Just remember to move right each time. This time we are in the 5 cabins on the far right. Next time it should be the cabins on the far left. Once you are familiar with it, you can come here directly by yourself. There aren't many rules. Just don't forget to be on duty. "Okay," Colin replied. Holt dragged him to the middle cabin. The guard team, a squad plus the captain, 5 people in total, usually stationed the middle cabin by the captain for easy assistance and support. On the first day of each month, all members will meet in the middle cabin, mainly to collect their monthly salary from me. They should be almost here by now, and you can also get to know each other, Holt said as he pushed open the door. Colin nodded. He had been in the West City Guard team for so long, yet he had only met Captain Holt and the Minister Barton. "Boss, you finally came?" As soon as the door was opened, an excited, thick male voice entered his ears. Colin looked in the direction of the voice. A fat man sitting at the innermost part of the middle wooden table was speaking, standing up as he did so. Beside him sat a man and a woman. "Captain." The man had a cold expression and called softly after seeing Holt come in. The woman was wearing a veil, making her face indiscernible, but her eyes seemed quite gentle. However, Colin soon retracted this assessment. "Orlando, one day you're going to die because of that half-elf woman." The woman loudly teased the fat man who had stood up before. Her voice was rough, and her tone was quite harsh. Orlando ignored her and earnestly approached Holt, reaching out his hand. "Catherine is right. You need to control yourself, Orlando." Holt sighed, feeling somewhat helpless, yet he still pulled out 10 magic stones and handed them to him. Orlando took the magic stones and chuckled while scratching his head. "I know, boss." Holt sighed again, but didn't say anything more. "Captain, aren't you going to introduce the new member?" the stern Willard suddenly asked. The masked Catherine also looked over with interest. "This is Colin, who just advanced to an intermediate apprentice last month," Holt introduced. "So, he's the newbie?" Catherine looked at Colin and asked, "Can you instantly cast the fireball technique and the hope defense field yet?" "Not yet," Colin responded. "But I—" Catherine frowned slightly, then casually added, "With that level, you cannot handle fierce beasts. Stick close to me later, call me sister, and I'll protect you." Her tone was spiteful, more teasing than caring. "Catherine, didn't expect you to be into that." "Sister, really? You're over 30, old enough to be someone's mom. Don't you feel embarrassed?" Orlando's mocking voice suddenly interrupted. The room went silent. Boom! Immediately after, a huge fireball shot explosively toward Orlando. Orlando's expression changed drastically as he hurriedly put up a translucent blue protective shield. Still, he couldn't withstand the fireball. The shield quickly shattered, and he was knocked to the ground. Seeing this, Colin's eyelid twitched. Judging by the power of the fireball, another 2 shots could breach his steel armor. "Old woman, was that really necessary?" Orlando scrambled to his feet, furious. On closer inspection, aside from some slight scorch marks on his clothes, he seemed to have sustained no other injuries. "That's enough." Holt quickly intervened, raising his hand to extinguish the spreading flames. Then he cast a stream of green light, and the charred and damaged spots on the wooden cabin walls began sprouting and growing, slowly mending the holes. Yet Catherine couldn't help but remain furious, her magic power brewing stormily. "I said that's enough." Seeing this, Holt spoke out again, his voice coldly issuing a few words. As his words fell, a chilling aura suddenly descended inside the cabin. For a moment, Colin thought he saw a massive, tangled black ancient tree swaying in the shadows behind Holt. "Sorry, boss." Orlando hastily apologized. "Sorry, Captain." Catherine also paled, her voice softening in submission. Though Holt was usually mild-mannered and didn't mind their way of speaking, when he got angry, they still felt terrified. The chilling aura suddenly dissipated, and Colin exhaled in relief. He looked up just in time to see Willard across from him also exhaling lightly. The two exchanged glances, feeling an unintended camaraderie as collateral victims. Holt had returned to his gentle demeanor and handed out magic stones to Catherine and Willard. Then he urged them to quickly head to their cabins for their shift. Before they left, he specifically instructed Colin to stay in the cabin on his left for easier coordination. Although he had a certain understanding of Colin's strength and knew he was much stronger than a newly advanced intermediate apprentice, in his eyes, Colin was still just a month into his advancement. Even if strong, his strength was limited, and in terms of versatility, he probably couldn't compare to a seasoned intermediate apprentice. Leaving the wooden hut, Orlando snorted coldly and pulled Willard to the right. Colin, on the other hand, was forced to go left with Catherine. They walked one after the other. "Kid, you better not have any ideas about me," Catherine suddenly said, turning back to glance at Colin, then coldly continued. "Orlando has nothing but junk in his head, and I hope you're not the same." Colin's expression remained unchanged, but he was quite astonished inside, suddenly unsure of how to respond. Observing Colin's calm demeanor, Catherine furrowed her brows and said sternly, "Sometimes, daring to admit your thoughts is what makes a real man. I really have no such thoughts about you." Colin stopped in his tracks and said solemnly. His face was calm and his tone sincere. Catherine scoffed and continued walking forward, her expression disdainful. Colin frowned and chose to wait a few more minutes on the spot until Catherine's figure had become a small dot, then slowly began to walk. What an undeserved calamity, he sighed inwardly. He hadn't anticipated Catherine's terrible personality. Thankfully, the guardhouses were roughly 500 meters apart from one another, which could spare him some awkwardness. Entering the hut, Colin took out a bright crystal and lit it up, placing it on a wooden lamp holder on one side of the wall. With a soft white light, he surveyed the inside of the room. It was laid out just like the one Captain Holt had been in, a large single room with a bathroom, with a set of tables and chairs to the left of the entrance. In the middle of the room was a clean-looking soft mat, similar to a tatami. It seemed to have been changed recently. Still, Colin cast a cleaning technique on it before slowly sitting down. Knock, knock, knock. Just as Colin had sat down, a knocking came from outside. Could it be that fierce beasts are attacking so soon? He furrowed his brows and quickly got up to open the door. "My lord." As he opened the door, there stood a burly city guard captain dressed in fine steel armor, taking off his helmet and placing it in his left hand, then respectfully touching his chest in greeting. Behind him were several city guards, also in plate armor and having taken off their helmets to salute. "Is it a fierce beast attack?" Colin asked. "Why not launch the signal flare?" "No, my lord. We have come especially to meet you," the city guard captain hastily explained, then added, "You just started your duty, and you might not be aware that our squad is responsible for your lordship's area." Before Colin could respond, the captain gestured behind him, took a huge gray cloth bag from one of his men, and passed it to Colin. "This is a little token of our regards. Please accept it, my lord." The city guard captain held the cloth bag with both hands, nervously watching Colin. For the patrolling city guards, establishing a good relationship with the on-duty wizard was especially important. When fierce beasts attacked, perhaps just by the duty wizard paying a little more attention, spotting the signal flare sooner, and arriving a mere 10 seconds to half a minute earlier, it could save them from losing a life. Colin hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take it. He had gradually become accustomed to the rules of this world. "My lord, we ask for your care in the future. We won't disturb you any further now." Seeing Colin take it, the city guard captain sighed with relief and then asked to leave. Colin calmly nodded, watching them as they lifted their torches and marched away to patrol. The city guards were a force apart from the 4 great gangs and the 3 great families, directly under City Lord Price Bennett. Price Bennett was an aging wizard apprentice at his peak, about over 90 years old, frilier, with no hope left for advancing. His sole desire now was to see his bloodline flourish and spread. The schools always looked down upon other forces from high above, unwilling to waste their energy on Blackstone City's trivial matters. Thus, they quickly came to an agreement with Price. Price took care of the minutiae of running Blackstone City for the schools, who, apart from sending the guard team to deal with polluters, cults, and fierce beasts, simply waited each month to collect their dues. Colin thought about this as he stepped over to the window, gazing into the distance towards the mountain top where the Lap School was. In the schools, the vast majority of wizards stay in the wizard territory. They enjoy the offerings of the entire city, free from trivial bothers, focusing solely on climbing ahead, except for required missions. But the guard team could only stay in this place. He exhaled and took out the golden paper. The progress of the intermediate apprentice above halted at 2/100. It seems that my own wizard training progress is so slow, not only because it becomes more difficult to improve after advancing, but also because the magic power in Blackstone City is far less dense than in the wizard territory. He sighed softly in his heart, walked to the cushion in the middle of the room, and sat down cross-legged. On patrol, the team members whispered among themselves. "Do you think the new wizard can be trusted? He looks even younger than me. Yet just our luck. We finally get a new wizard, and it just happens to be on our shift. Let's just hope no fierce beasts attack this month." Alas, the weaker they are, the nicer they seem. He looked so gentle when he was giving out gifts. His strength is probably... "Shut up," the guard captain scolded in a deep voice. "Do not discuss wizards behind their backs." The team members fell silent. The guard captain paused, then added, "Be more cautious this coming month. If fierce beasts attack, run faster." He casually supplemented, "Prioritize running to the nearest cabin. I remember the one on the left is that veiled witch." "Yes, Captain." The team members immediately understood. Most of them came from the lower levels of the city, and although they had braced themselves for danger when they chose to join the city guards, coming from the lower classes meant they were likely the main support of their families, which made them cherish their own lives even more. The guard captain continued to lead the patrol with a torch in hand, his expression calm while his heart was somewhat uneasy. The concerns of his team were also his concerns. It had been a long time since such a young wizard had come to West City. In the past, they wouldn't worry so much when a new wizard arrived, since the fierce beasts were not strong. But in recent years, the power of the fierce beasts had been growing, and not long ago, a wizard had fallen here. If the strength of the new wizard from the Lap School was weaker, it wouldn't affect him much. If in danger, the nearby wizards would help, and it was hard to lose one's life. But for them, it was completely different. Although he hinted that the team members should be smart and run towards the stronger wizards, in reality, the lives of everyone in their squad were bound to the duty wizard they were assigned to. If the wizard died, so would they, eventually. Time flew by. That night was calm, without any attack from fierce beasts, only occasionally interrupted by the sound of city guards patrolling. Colin glanced at the clock on the shelf on the wall, slowly stood up, gathered his things, and prepared to go home. The duty work for the guard team, as Holt had said, wasn't very rule-bound. Just come when it's time, leave when it's time. There was no need to report to anyone, nor was there any performance assessment. Only improper handling of fierce beasts, such as being absent when an attack happened that caused damage, would there be punishment. Picking up the gray cloth bag the city guards had given him last night from the wooden table, Colin opened the door and walked outside. Inside the bag was a large piece of fresh meat, which, if not mistaken, was probably fierce beast meat. But what kind of animal it was, Colin really couldn't tell. However, whatever the type, fierce beast meat was a good thing. It could strengthen the bodies of ordinary people who ate it regularly. Of course, its biggest benefit was aiding knights in their training. The reason why all the city guards were knights, and the captains were all great knights, was due to the assistance from the fierce beast meat. Aside from that, fierce beast meat was also an invisible benefit for the West City Guard team. Beasts killed by wizards were all bought up by the city guards. If they encountered many fierce beasts in a month, they could even earn a few extra magic stones. As Colin stepped out of the cabin, he happened to meet the wizard coming to take over the shift, also a member of the lab school. They greeted each other amicably. In fact, Colin had seen him from afar when he arrived at the cabin last night. However, probably due to spending some time in Holt's cabin, they didn't actually meet face to face. West City's fields accounted for over 80% of Blackstone City's food production, and any problems could lead to dire consequences. Therefore, essentially, there was always a wizard guarding this place. The days that followed were peaceful and fulfilling. Every evening, Colin would take a carriage to his shift and return by carriage the next morning. Thanks to the abundant energy provided by the sunlight breathing technique and Renee's diligent and competent help, he found even more time for cultivation each day. On the third night, Colin was practicing in the cabin. Bang! The distinct sound of a signal flare came from afar. Colin quickly pushed the door open and looked in the direction where the signal flare had lit up. It was off to the far left. After the signal flare lit up, soon, there were faint roars and sounds of combat. Then, the brilliance of witchcraft followed from the area of the fight. If he was not mistaken, that should be beyond Catherine's area of responsibility. According to what Holt had said, it should be the Chiwen gang's area. As wizards began to join the battle, cries of wild beasts could also be heard increasingly. Colin suppressed his urge to go and check, and returned inside the cabin. Although Holt had introduced him to much knowledge about fierce beasts, he had never actually encountered them in person. After all, it was merely theoretical. Being able to observe a battle between a fierce beast and wizards would surely benefit him greatly when he had to face fierce beasts alone in the future. It was a pity that it wasn't wise to recklessly head to other wizards' areas in the dark of night. He resumed his cultivation, but the mournful cries of the fierce beasts and the sounds of their battle with the wizards lasted a long time and seemed to grow closer. Colin couldn't help but go out the door once more, his thoughts quickly changing as he leaped onto the roof. He looked to the left. A wizard in the distance had cast the light brightness skill for illumination. With Colin's enhanced sight, he could clearly see a skinny figure in a wizard robe chasing a huge shadow of a fierce beast. A few city guards with torches were following the skinny figure. Upon closer inspection, Colin finally recognized the shadow of the fierce beast. Thick black bristles, nostrils pointed skyward, and its snout flanked by two curved tusks. It was undoubtedly an oversized wild boar. Colin felt a mix of shock and confusion. This boar is almost the size of an elephant from my past life. Holt's descriptions had never included one this large. He cast the golden cleaning technique below him on the roof and slowly sat down, facing the distance. Though the wild boar fierce beast was large, it had little resistance against the mighty power of a wizard. It could only howl mournfully while fleeing in a pathetic state. Had it not been for its strong life force, and the fact that the frail wizard seemed to have never learned any teleportation witchcraft, the wild boar fierce beast would have died at the hands of the wizard long ago. But for the moment, the frail wizard appeared to be slower than the wild boar fierce beast by a fair margin, and it would take some time to catch up. Regardless, the defeat of the wild boar fierce beast was only a matter of time. This will be a good learning experience. Colin shifted his position, adjusting his angle to get a good view of the chase unfolding before him. However, it wasn't long before his expression began to turn strange. The wild boar fierce beast's life force was terrifyingly strong. He watched as the frail wizard behind it fired several energy missiles in succession, blasting many large wounds on the back of the wild boar fierce beast. But the speed of the wild boar fierce beast seemed to increase instead of decreasing, showing no signs of faltering. It was about to run into the area under Catherine's responsibility. Swoosh! Just then, the frail wizard behind slowed down his pace and began to mutter. 2 seconds later, a huge pale blue missile soared towards the wild boar fierce beast in front. Boom! This supercharged missile directly shattered the wild boar fierce beast's hindquarters. The wild boar fierce beast crashed to the ground, its bulky body causing a dull thud upon impact. The frail wizard also sighed in relief, slowing down and waiting for the city guards behind to come and clean up the mess. On the roof, Colin stood up. The show was over, and now it was time to get back to his training. If the fierce beasts he would face were only of this level of strength, then he had nothing to worry about. SSSS. Suddenly, a strange sound came through. It sounded like the squirming of maggots on rotting flesh. Colin's eyebrows furrowed as he looked towards the source of the sound. The next second, his pupils slightly constricted. The fierce boar that had fallen earlier was slowly getting back up. With his strong vision, Colin could still vaguely see that the shattered flesh on the boar's originally mangled rump was unbelievably wriggling and healing. The boar continued to flee, quickly running into the territory of Catherine nearby. The skinny wizard hesitated for a moment, but ultimately continued the chase. The tenacity of this beast's life force was beyond his imagination, but it probably was nearing its last leg. The wild boar raced swiftly, soon crossing most of the area under Catherine's responsibility. Colin's expression changed. If the boar kept running for a bit longer, it would reach his responsibility zone. His legs bent slightly as he leapt off the rooftop, casting steel armor and hope defensive field on himself while running towards the direction of the boar. As a great knight, he moved much faster than the skinny wizard. In just a moment, he had arrived at the border of his and Catherine's assigned zones, and the fierce boar in front of him was already not far away. Colin prepared for combat, but the boar seemed to have been merely on its last breath before, and its current state looked very poor. Its once bright red eyes had dimmed. It panted heavily from its mouth, and blood gushed from the wound on its back in large amounts. Whoosh! Another missile struck the boar from behind. With a thud, the boar fell to the ground again, its enormous body sliding forward a distance due to inertia. Finally, it stopped about 50 meters away from Colin. A piercing wail came from its mouth, and then gradually weakened. The skinny wizard caught up at this moment, delivering another strike to the beast, conclusively killing it. Then, he looked up at Colin and nodded slightly as a sign of acknowledgement. Colin nodded back and turned to leave. This boar's body could probably sell for at least 5 magic stones at the city guards, he thought to himself. Whoosh! Unexpectedly, a heat wave surged from directly behind him. Colin's hair stood on end as he turned to look back. Bang! A fireball exploded on the boar's body, the scorching flames meticulously controlled by the caster to singe only the dark fur before quietly dissipating. What do you mean by this? The skinny wizard looked to the left, a gloom settling over his face. Colin followed his gaze. A veil which accompanied by a squad of city guards was slowly approaching. That was Catherine. I'm dealing with the attacking beast. Are you blind? Catherine coldly replied, then turned to command the city guards beside her to deal with the beast's carcass. I killed this beast, the skinny man said coldly, his voice unable to conceal his anger. Where are we? Is this area under your responsibility? This beast was clearly killed by me in my designated area. Are you trying to steal the spoils of the lap school? Catherine retorted sarcastically. Seeing the situation turning sour, Colin quietly slipped away into the background. Besides, just because you say you killed it, does that make it so? Does anyone bear witness? Do you have one? The skinny wizard angrily challenged. Catherine laughed softly, responding in a calm and unhurried tone. Of course I do. Isn't that right, Colin? She slowly turned her head, gazing silently at Colin. The skinny wizard also turned his head. Both of them looked at Colin together. Colin stopped, his expression ugly. The arrogant demeanor of Catherine truly reshaped his understanding of the school members. And all he did was come to watch the fun. So why drag him into it? What it meant to be collateral damage, he had certainly found out today. Colin, as a member of the lap school, can you tell him who killed this fierce beast? Catherine asked again. The thin wizard had initially been looking forward to Colin's answer. But the next second, upon seeing the same triangular badge on Colin that Catherine wore, his expression changed. He almost forgot that this month, this whole area was under the patrol of lab school members. The anger in his heart gradually faded. Looking at Catherine and Colin, he began to back down. Although the male wizard standing nearby seemed uninterested in intervening, what if he did? The lab school always acted overbearingly. It was always their rivals who ended up on the losing side. You are right, sir. Since the fierce beast died here, it belongs to you. I won't interrupt. After all, we are all wizards on duty together, which can be called colleagueship. There's no need to spoil the amity. The thin wizard forced a smile, feigned a gentle tone, and then slowly began to retreat. Boom! But what greeted him was another fireball. His quickly deployed defensive witchcraft managed to block the burning damage, but the shock wave sent him flying high and crashing hard onto the ground. Get lost! Catherine snorted coldly. Suppressing the dizziness in his head, the thin wizard got up, said nothing, and quickly left for the distance. In terms of status, he was just a deacon of the Chiwen gang. In terms of strength, he was far inferior to her, and even if the male wizard by her side didn't intervene, he stood no chance. Staying any longer would have been simply humiliating himself. Although that was the case, his heart's anger found no solace and instead intensified. He had already yielded and given her a way out. Lap school. Masked bitches. His steps grew heavier, trampling the crops beneath his feet in frustration. Meanwhile, Colin was just about to speak up for the thin wizard, but the words were unexpectedly caught in his throat. Watching the thin wizard's fleeing figure, any sense of justice within him shattered abruptly. He felt it was ridiculous. Just leaving like that, swallowing the insult? Colin stood there, feeling inexplicably annoyed. Clean up quickly. Catherine, standing nearby, was urging the city guards who were dissecting the fierce beast's corpse, her expression arrogant. As for Colin beside her, she seemed to have already disregarded him. Colin stood there a while longer, watching the thin wizard gradually disappear into the darkness. Only after the fierce beast was almost completely dissected did he slowly turn back to his own duty cabin. The next day, the sky was faintly bright. Colin walked out of the cabin, finishing another day's duty. Although the sunlight breathing technique had given him plenty of energy, a night without sleep was naturally tiring. He was looking forward to getting home. He thought Renee must have prepared breakfast meticulously for him. He wondered what he would have this morning. After eating, he would crawl back into a warm bed and comfortably sleep a little. Life indeed could be satisfying. But a few steps out, the faint noise from afar caught his attention. As Catherine's duty cabin was to his left, and so was the city gate further left, he always passed by Catherine's area on his way back to the city. The noisy sounds were coming from the fields Catherine was in charge of. Colin looked over. Before him was an endless expanse of fields, which now bore signs of damage. He hadn't noticed it last night, but in the daylight, the destruction of the fields was considerable. The fierce beasts, like wild boars, had rampaged through the fields like bulldozers, overturning crops and splattering mud everywhere, creating a long gully. Especially where the black-haired wild boar had fallen, a huge pit had formed. But the pit formed by the carcass of the black-haired boar was not as shocking as another dark, burnt pit nearby. That burnt pit was at least twice the size of the boar's pit, radiating outward from the center, where the innermost wheat seedlings had turned into black ash. It must have been when Catherine used the fireball to attack the frail wizard last night and didn't extinguish it in time, Colin surmised. Otherwise, a single fireball couldn't have caused such a large burnt pit. Right next to the pit formed by the boar, a group of emaciated farmers surrounded it, with city guards standing behind them, and the noisy sounds were coming from there. Snap! Snap! Every now and then, the sound of a city guard's whip slicing through the air could be heard. Colin paused to watch for a while. The city guards were urging and directing them to lift and replant the flattened crops. But it seemed ineffective. Only a few of the crops could be salvaged, and most were beyond recovery. The wheat appeared to be near maturity. At least the wheat seeds on the ears looked almost ripe. The gaunt farmers picked up scattered wheat ears as they straightened the stalks, placing them in the bamboo baskets beside them. Colin thought inexplicably of Captain Holt. If he had been there, perhaps he could have saved some of the wheat. Unfortunately, in this world, wizards held themselves above all, and who would bother with such trivialities? The annual crop yield affected only ordinary people. Even if there were no harvests on the island this year, the wizards wouldn't starve. They had other means to obtain food. In his previous world, the lower-class people in war-torn countries suffered severe famines, yet the rich lived in luxury. Such inequality was even more pronounced in this world. If ordinary people weren't necessary for some reason, wizards wouldn't care about their fate nor specifically protect the fields. Colin shook his head and continued towards the city. Soon, his familiar black carriage appeared in front of him. This time, however, Arthur wasn't the only one standing by the carriage. "Master," Renee greeted him as she approached. "Why are you here? Don't you need to look after Demi?" Colin asked in surprise. "Demi can take care of herself now." "I came to bring you breakfast, Master," Renee said with a slight smile, lifting the food basket in her hand to show Colin. Colin was somewhat surprised. West City was quite a distance from his residence, almost half an hour by carriage. So, after a night's duty without any food, he indeed felt hungry sitting in the carriage. In the past few days, he had been eating only after getting home. He hadn't thought to have Renee bring him breakfast directly. He was pleasantly surprised and praised Renee a few times. Renee bringing him breakfast meant he could eat on the carriage ride home and go straight to sleep once he got there, saving quite a bit of time. The two of them boarded the carriage together. Arthur remained silent throughout, merely bowing respectfully to Colin when he saw him. He's a competent coachman. Colin was quite satisfied with him. "By the way, Arthur, did you finish the thing I asked you to do?" Colin suddenly remembered something and asked Arthur just before stepping into the carriage. "It's done, Master," Arthur replied. Colin nodded in satisfaction. It seemed Arthur was quite efficient. What he had asked Arthur to make was actually a wooden target. To become proficient in witchcraft, one could not rely solely on theory. Hiss! A barely perceptible whistling sound passed through the air, followed by a loud collision noise. Bang! It was intermixed with the shrill sound of bending metal. The metal arrow had pierced through the iron plate on the chest of the humanoid wooden target, and the remaining kinetic energy caused it to topple backward, making a thud as it hit the smooth basement floor. Colin stepped forward to examine it closely. The wooden target was nearly the size of a person, its lower half a huge counterweight block of iron, and on its chest hung a piece of iron, so thick it could be called a block. The iron plate was about a dozen centimeters thick and had been completely penetrated by the metal arrow. A satisfied expression appeared on Colin's face. This was still the first time he had used the limit-breaking arrow shooting skill on a physical object with full force. When he had killed the thug, North, he had only used 1/10 of his power, far from his full strength. Now it seemed that the power of the arrow shooting skill, after one limit breaking, exceeded his imagination. At least the steel armor witchcraft before limit breaking was absolutely unable to defend against it. If it were the steel armor after one limit breaking, maybe it would be a 50-50 chance. But the metal arrows seemed somewhat inappropriate. Colin slowly drew out the arrow, pondering deeply. Now that the arrow shooting skill had its power deficiency compensated for after limit breaking, it still required arrows. But ordinary arrows were not convenient to carry. Perhaps it was time to switch to a more portable arrow. After one limit breaking, his understanding of the arrow shooting skill had deepened. He knew it was not limited to just shooting arrows. As long as it was a suitable metal, after certain adjustments, it could be launched via the arrow shooting skill. Putting thought into action, Colin walked upstairs, instructing Arthur to go to the blacksmith to forge several different models to test their effects. Upon receiving the order, Arthur immediately drove off. These days, such miscellaneous tasks had always been his responsibility. Meanwhile, Renee was preparing dinner on the other side, while little Demi played alone in the yard. The yard was originally supposed to be a well-maintained garden, but now it was overgrown with weeds, and there was a huge coconut tree on the left. After moving in, they only roughly cleared the weeds once and didn't maintain it carefully afterward, making these random wildflowers and plants become Demi's playground. She wasn't afraid of Colin and just played around with a small wooden stick. Colin beckoned her over and pinched her face. Demi was 5 years old this year, both her looks and personality extremely likable. In the modern world, she certainly would have been the kind of child who walked around during New Year's collecting red envelopes until her hands were sore. Initially, Colin was worried about her playing alone unsafely. For example, the coconut tree on the left often dropped coconuts, fearing that one might accidentally hit her. But the children of this world were far sturdier than those of his previous world and knew how to avoid many dangers. Eventually, he got used to her, a 5-year-old, playing around by herself. After all, even her sister, Renee, was not worried. After playing with Demi for a while, Colin felt sufficiently rested and continued to return to the basement to practice witchcraft. He was ultimately not some non-human with a monstrously firm will. Apart from the golden paper, he was just an ordinary man, unable to continue training like a machine every day. No doing other things, no socializing, no entertainment. So he would occasionally chat with Renee, pinch Demi's chubby cheeks. As for Arthur, he was a taciturn type and always stiff around him, so Colin rarely sought him out for a chat. The new arrow models were ready by the next day. Last night, another wild boar, a fierce beast of the same kind, had attacked. But unfortunately for it, it had stumbled into the territory of Captain Holt, and within a few meters had been strangled to death by vines. To distinguish, Holt had named the beast the black-maned giant pig last night. Its characteristic was its unusually large size. The dark forest was an extremely dangerous place. Perhaps only the wizards of the Lap School felt confident to traverse it safely. The origins of these fierce beasts within the dark forest remained unknown. The only certainty was that the beasts were growing stronger, something Colin had heard others lament more than once. After finishing his shift and waking up, Arthur had brought him several different models of new arrows. The next evening, inside the duty cabin, one by one, new shuttle-shaped arrows, or perhaps darts, were tossed by Colin into the soft, beast leather pouch arranged on the table, clinking against each other. After it was half filled, Colin secured it at his waist for close storage. This wasn't the only place on his body where he stored shuttle-shaped darts. To avoid the embarrassment of running out, he placed varying amounts of the darts in multiple locations on his person. In addition, he also carried some dry food Renee had made, just in case. With everything ready, he waited quietly inside the cabin. By all logic, tonight the black-maned giant pigs should also attack. And what he needed to do was wait for the city guards on patrol to detect movement, pull the signal flare, and then he would rush over quickly. Before that, Holt and Marlowe, a first-class apprentice of the Chiwin gang, would arrive before him to mark the wild pigs. Then they would wait for him to meet up with them at the spot, and together they would follow the marks in pursuit. Outside the window, the moonlight was bright, with silver moonbeams pouring into the room and quietly merging with the gentle white light of the bright crystals. With the weather being clear tonight, the sky full of stars, and even without the need for torches, one could clearly see everything in the fields. Sitting inside the room for a long time, the signal flare took a while to come. Colin remained focused on it, and somehow found it hard to settle down to meditate. I still haven't experienced a real battle, he thought to himself with a light chuckle, not really feeling any particular way about it. Tests, interviews, fighting bosses in games, or even before starting a trip, it's hard for anyone to avoid a bit of an accelerated heartbeat. This feeling, a mix of excitement, tension, anticipation, and fear, is complex and only natural. Colin stepped out of the door, bent his knees slightly, and then leaped onto the roof. The landscape outside West City was flat, which was not only good for farming, but also meant the view was rarely obstructed. He stood on the rooftop with a clear panoramic view. Groups of city guards wielding torches patrolled the fields in a systematic rhythm, creating orange trails in the darkness. A cool breeze passed, and his heart gradually calmed. As usual, he cast a golden cleaning technique on the rooftop below him, then sat down with his legs crossed, starting to meditate. Time continued to slip away. Clip-clop, clip-clop. The footsteps of the city guards approached from afar, then grew distant, patrolling back and forth. After an undefined period, boom, An orange signal flare burst suddenly into the night sky, distinctly visible. In an instant, Colin's fair complexion was coated with a thin orange glow. His mind hadn't caught up, but his body had already leapt down from the cabin. Before his toes even touched the ground, he heard a whizzing sound from the wooden house to his right. Looking up, he saw a figure soaring into the sky, hurrying towards the direction from which the flare had come. It was Holt. Glancing to the left, there was also a wizard flying rapidly through the night sky, probably Marlowe from the Chiwen gang. Colin exhaled slightly, feeling his blood inexplicably restless. He hesitated no longer and hurried along the ridges of the fields. The wind whistled past his ears, and his strong and agile legs accurately stepped on the narrow earthen paths. Before long, he saw flickering lights in the distance. After a short while, the distinct shrieks of the black-maned giant pigs also reached his ears with the breeze. As he drew closer, however, the shrieks of the black-maned giant pigs grew more distant. By the time he reached the spot of the lights, all he saw were a small troop of city guards holding torches and the wizards, Holt and Marlowe, standing and waiting. Perhaps because the black-maned giant pigs had attacked in the area he was responsible for, he turned out to be the earliest to arrive next to Holt and Marlowe. After greeting them respectfully, Colin stood aside and waited. In the field ahead, many stalks of wheat lay flattened, creating a clear, visible path leading towards the dark forest. It seems Holt and his team have already marked the black-maned giant pig and driven it back to the dark forest, he speculated to himself. Tap, tap, tap. With the sound of footsteps drawing nearer, more and more wizards gathered around him, and it didn't take long for everyone to arrive. After looking around and counting heads, Holt issued his command in a clear and concise manner. Let's move out. He took the lead, walking ahead, while Marlowe took up the rear of the group. Before long, they followed the tracks to the edge of the dark forest. Once inside the forest, tighten formation, watch out for each other, and don't fall behind. Before entering the forest, Holt stopped in his tracks, turned back, and solemnly reminded them. Colin walked right behind him, with Catherine and other squad members at his side. After Holt finished his reminder, he cast the light brightness skill to summon a light orb that floated before him. Then he stepped into the forest first. Colin followed closely behind. As soon as he stepped into the dark forest, he distinctly felt a stark contrast from the outside world. The dark forest was exceptionally silent, with an inexplicable sense of eeriness. Colin surveyed his surroundings by the soft white light of the orb. All around grew trees of various shapes, some with intertwined roots and crooked forms, others tall and straight with lush foliage. But they all shared one common feature. That was the deep, almost black color of their bark and leaves. This color made them look like pure black shadows. Staring for too long would even give one the illusion that they were twisting and swaying. Holt led the group forward steadily, occasionally making slight adjustments to their direction. Along the way, Colin spotted many signs of the black-maned giant pig's activity. The group also encountered several snake and insect attacks, but Holt or Marlowe resolved them beforehand. After a while, Holt suddenly quickened his pace, no longer adjusting direction, and headed straight towards a fixed point. That black-maned giant pig must have returned to its lair and settled down, Colin conjectured in his mind. After a brief, swift march, the group arrived at a hollow in the hillside, facing a huge, pitch-black cave. Stop! Holt motioned backward with his hand, caution apparent on his face. Rashly entering the cave was clearly not a wise decision. He pondered for a moment and called Marlowe over. I have a way to ascertain the situation inside the cave, but I may need your assistance, he said. Marlowe nodded, indicating for him to continue. Holt took out a rice, grain-sized seed from his chest and said, This is a May grass seed, which after growing can roughly sense the vitality of living creatures nearby. I need you to help me scatter it evenly into the cave. No problem, Marlowe agreed. He took the brown seeds, tossed them into the air, and a gentle breeze lifted the brown seeds, quietly flying into the cave. Soon after, Marlowe nodded and said, It's done. Holt nodded slightly and began casting a spell. Inside the cave, the May grass seeds, scattered at intervals on the ground, quietly sprouted, their fragile husks gradually torn, the shoots peeking out and quickly growing into about 10-centimeter tall May grass, with fine fuzz swaying in the wind. Outside the cave, Holt closed his eyes and carefully sensed his surroundings. Moments later, he opened his eyes, a smile appearing on his face as he said lightly, "Let's move out. There are only a few dozen ordinary fierce beasts inside, most likely all black-maned giant pigs. This must be their lair." A group of people walked into the cave. Colin only felt that the huge dark hole was like a terrifying big mouth, slowly devouring them. But this was just an illusion. The next second, the wizards used light spells one after another, and the soft white light illuminated the cave as if it were daytime. They walked quickly towards the depths of the cave, and soon came to a wide hall where a group of black-maned wild boars were sleeping together. Holt glanced around, and when he determined that the only exit here was the cave entrance from which they came, he gave the order, "Free to kill." He was the first to perform the technique, and several knotted vines suddenly appeared among the wild boars. They seemed to be slow, but in fact they quickly bound and entangled the nearby black-maned giant boar. Eee! The entangled giant black bristle pig screamed in pain, and its sleeping companions nearby were also woken up. Mallory on the side was not to be outdone. With a wave of his hand, a light blue wind blade shot out. Each shot could accurately take away the life of a giant pig. Most of the intermediate apprentices on the side worked much harder, and it often took a while to completely kill a giant black-maned pig. However, Willard and Catherine, who were also members of the team, surprised Colin. They slaughtered the giant black-maned boar more efficiently than the other apprentices. The acid splash used by Willard was a very ordinary witchcraft, but it was very powerful in his hands. The black-maned giant pig that was hit by the attack soon had its brain corroded by the acid and died. Although Catherine is arrogant, it must be said that her fireball technique is indeed superb. She did not choose to shoot the black-maned wild boar directly with fireball, but let the fireball continue to cover the black-maned giant boar's face. Often not long after, accompanied by the aroma of roasted pig brains, a giant black-maned pig suddenly fell to the ground and lost its life. This operation seems easy, but in fact it is not simple. Just hitting the head accurately is very difficult, not to mention the explosive fireball technique that continues to burn on the boar's head like gangrene attached to the bone. Colin looked away and took out the custom-made spear. Buzz! In silence, a huge hole opened from the neck of an adult black-maned giant pig at the edge of the cave hall, running from front to back. But even with such a serious injury, the giant black bristle pig was still alive and kicking, and the wound was healing quickly. The shot missed. Colin shook his head, took out another spear, and shot it. Whoosh! Boom! This time it was a perfect headshot. The giant pig fell down at the sound. 5 magic stones are in hand. A smile appeared on his face. In terms of killing efficiency alone, as long as he shoots more accurately, maybe even Catherine can't compare to him. As for the magic stone, the black-maned giant boar's lair is not far from the edge of the dark forest. At present, it seems that there is a high probability that it can be transported out. If you can transport it out, you can exchange it for magic stones. As for the ownership of the corpses of different black-maned giant pigs, it is obviously whoever kills them. Although 5 magic stones are not much, the reward in exchange for killing a few more is still considerable. Colin thought this, and soon he took out another spear and selected the suitable black-maned giant boar. Because the scene is great, and the giant black-maned boar can be exchanged for magic stones. Therefore, in order to avoid misunderstandings, the same giant black-maned pig will usually not be focused on, and everyone will tacitly focus on solving the one they selected. What do you mean? That giant pig is going to be killed by me soon. At this moment, there was an angry shout from the side. Colin glanced at it and saw that it was an intermediate apprentice from the Chiwin gang who was questioning Catherine. Catherine ignored him and continued to slaughter the wild boar without looking back. The two Holts not far away didn't pay much attention to this place. The intermediate apprentice finally suppressed his anger and changed to a giant pig to continue the attack. At this time, Catherine was summoning several fireballs and shooting them accurately towards the middle of the hall. There were a group of giant pig babies there that were obviously smaller than the other black-maned giant pigs. Colin shook his head. Just as he felt that everyone was restrained and understanding, Catherine overturned his idea. Whoosh! A spear was shot out by him again. Colin stopped thinking about it and focused on killing the giant pig, taking this rare opportunity to practice the accuracy of his arrow shooting. Under the constant attacks from everyone, the giant black bristle pig is just a turtle in an urn, and its number continues to decrease. Especially after Catherine killed most of the piglets in the middle, the remaining giant pigs rushed towards them crazily. Unfortunately, it was all in vain, but it made their output more comfortable. Roar! Just when Colin was obsessed with shooting, a violent roar suddenly came from the passage behind him. He froze, silently and quickly approached Holt, then turned and looked back. A giant pig with black manes that was obviously different from others of its kind was charging toward them. Its overall appearance is not much different from the ordinary black-maned giant pig, except that its fur is darker. But its size is at least twice the size of an ordinary giant pig. It is visually estimated to be at least 2 or 3 stories high, and its back almost touches the top of the cave. Not to mention its strength, its size gives people a strong sense of oppression. Perhaps it should be called the black-maned giant pig king. At this time, Holt and Mallory had also turned around, with solemn expressions on their faces. Judging from their formation, they were already surrounded. This black-maned giant pig is no longer a simple beast. Holt whispered, "Well, it seems to be much stronger than the ordinary black-maned wild boar." Mallory nodded and asked, "Are you going to deal with it?" "Okay, you go help others," Holt replied. Mallory nodded and went to the other end. "Shrink the formation and come behind me." At the same time, Holt shouted in a deep voice. The apprentices changed their formations one after another and came between the two. Roar! The black-maned giant pig king roared again, and the sound waves were mixed with inexplicable magic waves rolling in. After this roar, a hint of fatigue flashed undetectably in its violent eyes. However, there were still more than 20 black-maned giant pigs alive in the hall. At this time, their eyes turned red, and the wounds on their bodies that were already healing quickly healed even faster. The outer black mane also seems to be covered with a thin layer of black light. The defense becomes stronger and the recovery ability is strengthened. Now attacks from ordinary apprentices pose a great threat to them. Often the attack area would look dripping with blood 1 second, and then return to its intact appearance the next second. However, fortunately, Mallory was there to cover them, so they would not be rushed close by the giant black-maned pig in the hall. At this time, Colin also quickly added Hope's defensive force field to himself. Before that, he was concerned about the consumption of magic power, and only used steel armor. No longer able to hide his strength, the frequency of his spears suddenly doubled. Other wizards also tried their best. In this way, the situation was stabilized by them for a moment. Colin also breathed a sigh of relief. After a while, under their slaughter, the number of black-maned giant pigs in the hall gradually decreased to less than 10, and victory was right in front of them. Mallory! But at this moment, Holt's shout came from behind. Mallory looked back quickly. Colin's heart skipped a beat, and he glanced back subconsciously. Thanks to Confused Starry Sky for the 100 starting coin reward. Thanks for the 200 starting coin reward if you like the mini. Thanks to Cuckoo Chat for the 100 starting coin reward. By the way, I would like to recommend his Immortal Urn and Talisman Urn. It's a weird fairy cultivating novel. It's great. In addition, the update is a small chapter, a bit late, sorry. Some time ago, I couldn't stand staying up late to refresh my body. I felt uncomfortable everywhere. It must be because I didn't get enough sleep. I need to adjust my schedule. Too many people die suddenly these days. We must take precautions and develop sustainably. Otherwise, it will be over one day. After seeing the scene clearly, his heart slowly dropped again. Under Holt's attack, the black-maned giant boar king was now bound in place by countless strange vines. He was already dripping with blood and was obviously at a disadvantage. "Help me," Holt continued to add, continuing to apply magic. Only then did Colin notice that the vines wrapped around the giant pig king with black manes were breaking one by one. Mallory quickly cast a spell, but the giant pig king with black manes reacted faster than him. Roar! It roared suddenly. Its basketball-sized eyes flashed with red light. Its black mane instantly stood up like steel needles, and its muscles suddenly swelled. I saw it rush forward hard, with a stabbing sound, and all the remaining vines suddenly collapsed. Perhaps realizing that he was helpless, the giant black-maned pig king just glanced at Holt and others with a look full of hatred, then stopped fighting and turned around and ran away in an instant. The speed is extremely fast, and the distance is already more than 10 meters in the blink of an eye. Chase! Don't let it run away. Otherwise, there will be endless trouble. Holt quickly greeted Mallory. After you finish taking care of the remaining giant black bristle pigs, just wait where we come back. Mallory didn't hesitate, just gave a quick instruction to the other apprentices, and then chased after them with Holt. The situation in the hall is now clear. Even without him to hold the battle, the remaining intermediate apprentices can still deal with the few remaining black-maned giant pigs. On the other side, the dark forest has complex terrain and is full of dangers. What it has to deal with is a ferocious beast that is no weaker than an ordinary high-level wizard apprentice. Holt clearly needs his support more. As for letting it escape, that's obviously impossible. Not to mention that this black-maned wild boar king is a rare high-level ferocious beast and is worth a lot of money. Just because of the black-maned giant boar king's last hateful look, they still have to pursue it. No one wants to be thought about every day by a ferocious beast with the strength of a high-level wizard apprentice. Soon, Mallory followed Holt's figure and gradually disappeared around the far corner of the passage. The cave fell silent for a moment, and the remaining apprentices looked at each other in shock. But in an instant, the silence was broken by the roar of the remaining giant black-maned pigs. They no longer thought about it and continued to hunt down the remaining black-maned giant pigs. After some time, Colin slowly exhaled and put the spear in his hand back into the bag on his waist. At this time, there was only the last black-maned giant pig left in the cave hall. It was being attacked by an apprentice from the Chiwen gang. It was at the end of its strength and had only its last breath left. According to the tacit agreement, this giant pig belongs to him. No one interferes, they just watch quietly. But Colin seemed to have thought of something and glanced at Catherine not far away. But he hadn't turned his head completely yet. Roar! A familiar roar suddenly came. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly looked back behind him. A very familiar black-maned wild boar appeared at the corner of the passage in the distance. Why is it back again? Didn't Mr. Mallory and the others go after it? A member of the Chiwen gang subconsciously asked in panic. What should we do? It has the strength of a senior wizard apprentice, and we can't deal with it. Not the same one? Someone next to him retorted. Indeed, it's not the same head. Colin judged after careful observation. The appearance of this black-maned giant pig is very similar to the previous black-maned giant pig king, but its size is slightly smaller. Boom! At this moment, the last giant pig in the cave hall was killed and fell. Now everyone has turned around and faced the new black-maned giant pig. A look of fear appeared on their faces. During the apprenticeship period, advancing to a senior apprenticeship is a hurdle. Generally speaking, perhaps a dozen or 20 junior wizard apprentices can deal with intermediate wizard apprentices. But a dozen or 20 intermediate wizard apprentices could not deal with the high-level wizard apprentices. Even if you encounter some stronger senior wizard apprentices, doubling the number of intermediate apprentices may not be enough to deal with them. At this moment, the passage they came from was blocked by the huge body of the new, slightly smaller, black-maned giant pig king. Looking back, I saw that there was no exit in the cave hall behind me, only a pool in the corner. And the slightly smaller black-maned giant pig king in front of them is obviously no weaker than the black-maned giant pig king just now, which is comparable to a senior wizard apprentice. Already reached a desperate situation. No time to think too much. If everyone doesn't unite, they will be defeated one by one, and it will be a dead end. Colin moved his lips slightly, about to suggest that everyone fight together. Whether it's the same enemy or not, no matter whether we can deal with it or not, we have no way out. Only by preparing to attack together can we have hope. Stop hiding it, and use whatever skills you have to suppress the situation. Someone made the suggestion before him. When he looked up, he saw that he was still familiar. It was Orlando, the fat and unattractive guy from the same team. A trace of physical pain flashed across his face. He gritted his teeth and took out a yellow witchcraft crystal from his arms and activated it with magic power. He held it in his hand and waved it with one hand. A thorn as thick as a bucket suddenly emerged from the ground in front of the giant black bristle pig. Roar! The black bristle giant pig was caught off guard and crashed directly into it, and its huge body was forced to stop. But the earth thorn was blocked by its thick skin and could not cause much damage. The apprentices present took this opportunity to attack with all their strength. Many people, like Orlando, took out the witchcraft crystals from the bottom of the box. Anyone who can become a second-class apprentice is not a fool, and no one among them does not understand the current situation. If you are stingy with magic stones, and hide your trump card now, when you have such a good opportunity, if you fail to deal with the giant black bristle pig later, it will be too late to use your trump card. Fireball, Ice Spike, Acid Spear, Wind Blade. Countless witchcraft attacks of various shapes continued to shoot towards the black-maned giant pig that was temporarily fixed in place like a surge, exploding on it. The shock wave stirred up dust on the ground, causing smoke to billow for a while. It was actually somewhat difficult to see clearly the figure of the giant black bristle pig. After a while, the witchcraft crystal was used up, and the attack slowed down slightly. The smoke in the distance gradually faded, and a pair of eyes like blood-red flames quietly emerged from the smoke. Roar! A violent cry suddenly sounded, blowing away the remaining smoke and dust. The figure of the black-maned giant pig became clearly visible, and its body was actually covered with strange lines at this time. The next second, it was breathing heavily, bending its legs slightly, and leaning over. It's over. All the apprentices turned pale. Colin's pupils also shrank slightly, as if there was an invisible big hand holding his heart. He didn't have time to think too much and jumped to the right. But the black-maned wild boar is so fast that 1 second it was still in the smoke, and the next second it was already rushing forward. Even the speed of his great knight could not completely avoid it. Boom! His vision suddenly blurred, and by the time he reacted, he was already flying in the air, and the next second he fell heavily into the cave hall at the back like a slaughterhouse. There were 3 other people who had the same experience as him, all members of the Chiwen gang. This should be because he was standing on the far left side of his team, next to the Chiwen gang. The 3 Chiwen gang members looked much worse than Colin, and they had basically lost the ability to move. The tonnage of the black bristle giant boar was no lighter than the heavy truck in the previous life, and the speed of the red pattern blessing was even faster than the heavy truck at that moment. The defensive witchcraft of ordinary intermediate wizard apprentices is simply unable to withstand such an impact. The apprentices of the Chiwen gang only had half a breath left at most. But Colin relied on Hope's defensive force field, steel armor, and the knight's own blood armor, and in the end he only suffered some minor injuries. Boom! He fell to the ground and quickly turned over. Looking at the black-maned wild boar again, after this collision, it moved obviously slowly and seemed to have consumed a lot of energy. There is no time to hesitate. Now is the time to fight back. It's dying, attack quickly. Colin took out the spear and shouted at Catherine and others. On the other side, Catherine and others had just recovered from the shock. The power of the black-maned giant boar's collision just now was far beyond what they could handle, and it was no less powerful than a full blow from a senior wizard apprentice. They were extremely lucky that the direction of the collision was not from their side. At this time, Orlando heard Colin's cry and subconsciously wanted to step forward to help. Willard and the remaining thin wizards of the Chiwen gang followed closely behind. Boom! But as soon as they took a step, they heard a roar, and the cave passage behind them began to collapse. Orlando and others' expressions instantly changed, and they quickly turned back and rushed behind them. Colin also reacted at this moment, and he was shocked when he looked at the passage that collapsed for some reason. He rushed towards the passage in a hurry. Unfortunately, he was too far away from the passage. Boom! Before he could reach the passage, a huge rock fell to the ground with a deafening sound. Colin could only stop slowly in front of the gravel with a gloomy expression. At this time, roar! The roar of the giant black-maned pig came from behind again,